Hi, everybody. It's Eric Johnson. I'm Skyline's designated broker. The goal today is to um, go over in pretty good depth not only our purchase and sale agreement form, but financing contingency, optional clauses, inspection, talk briefly about a few other forms, and go into the buyer brokerage services agreement as well and how they all tie together. So that'll be the big goal. This class is gonna be approximately 3 hours long. At this point, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. If you are watching this class recorded, please email me as well. My email address is right here on the screen. It's eric@skylineproperties.com. Email me and ask me for the materials for this class separately, and I'll send those to you as well. I do want you to have things that you can refer to. Okay, today our focus is going to be the purchase and sale agreement form 21. There are other purchase and sale agreements. There's the condominium is form 28. We've got form 20, 23, and 25, different scenarios. And then there's also commercial purchase and sale agreement that can be very different. Anyway, today we're going to focus on Form 21. That's what you're going to be using more often than not. The majority of the time is residential purchase and sale agreement. We're going to be touching on the financing addendum, and that's for any of you who have clients who can't pay cash. That's the form you're going to be using. We're going to be dealing with an optional clauses form, the inspection form, and the buyer brokerage services agreement. Okay, so that's going to be the primary thing today. So with that, I'm going to jump over to the residential purchase and sale agreement. Philip, since I can see you, can you give me a thumbs up that you're seeing the residential purchase and sale agreement? Awesome. Okay. All right. Very good. So we're going to kind of go through this. I've had classes like this where I've read literally every line. Some of you have taken those classes, can attest to it. Those are crazy boring classes. Anyway, we are gonna hit some highlights, and I've highlighted some areas that we're going to be focusing on as well on the language pages. But for now, we're just going to chip away at this and go through it. I've pulled up a specific listing. And so I just grabbed, it's kind of a random listing. It's a home out in Enumclaw. It has no meaning to me whatsoever other than I grabbed it. And the main thing is I wanted something that had a lot of attached supplements. So here I'm going to show you, these are just things you want to look at on a listing. Okay, so there's a lot of things you may want to look at, like the price and the days on market and what type of financing they're going to take. But there's also attached supplements, and I've got that screen. Here it is. So here's the forms that the listing broker has been kind enough to include, which saves the buyer's agent some grief. They've included a FERPTA form. The 22E, that's valuable because we need to know what the citizenship status of the seller is. In this case, I think I've timed out on that. That's okay. We won't worry about what it does say. Oops. Oh, and I closed that window. Doggone it. Anyway, it's also got a Form 22K, which is the utilities addendum. That's where the seller is obligated to tell the buyer about which of their utilities are lienable utilities, so that the title and escrow company can pay those off at closing. But they also often tell you all of the utilities involved at the home. So it's kind of it's a valuable form for your buyers. They're going to know who they have to contact to switch on the electricity or change over the water or whatever it might be. The typical lienable utilities are only the water and sewer. There's a couple of areas that have lienable, like power, electric and gas, that kind of thing, but not many. And lienable means that the billing for that follows the house rather than the seller. Okay, so when the seller moves, their electric bill and their gas bill follow them. The water bill and the sewer bill stay with the home. So we want to make sure those get paid off by title. So that's the reason for the Form 22K. This one in particular also included a Form 22J. That's a lead-based paint addendum. We're not going to address that one today, but if you do have a home that's not older than 1978, you have to have a Form 22J included. The seller has to attest whether or not they know there's any lead-based paint. The buyer has to decide if they want to accept what the seller says, or do they want to test it themselves and have the option of terminating if they don't like the results of that test. Couple other things they included here is the legal description. I want you to always look at the legal description, especially if you're dealing with something that you think might be a condo, or you're not sure if it's a condo. And by the way, there are single family homes that can be condominiums. There's communities all over the Sound where a home that looks like it's on its own lot is actually a condo. And then townhomes can be condos, and sometimes they're not. So I want you to look at the legal description, and if it has the word condominium anywhere in the legal description, use Form 28. That's condominium purchase and sale agreement. Don't use Form 21. But if it doesn't say condominium, and you're not dealing with vacant land or a manufactured home in a park or commercial, then you can pretty much plan on using Form 21 and being correct. And that's the one we're going to go over to here as we get going. All right, real quickly, a couple other things that we want to go through here. Number one, it's important to you all to know the buyer brokerage compensation. That was once upon a time known as the SOC, the Selling Office Commission. We've now changed it to the BBC. And in this case, the seller is offering 2.5%. So that's good, okay? By the way, that's pretty much normal. 60% of all listings, active listings, as of the last 3 weeks are at 2.5%. I double checked that recently. Okay, so then we can, other things we want to look at real quickly here is going to be, we want to see what they're including as far as the appliances. In this case, dishwasher, dryer, microwave, refrigerator, and the washing machine. Here's the agent remarks. In this case, they're telling us that they're going to use Fidelity Title, and here's the closer that they put in place, Deneen Person. And then there's other information, but it won't be anything that we need to do in our offer. Okay, so that kind of gives us our starting point, and then we're going to jump back over to the Form 21. And just because I've switched a couple of times here, to want to make sure, are you all now seeing the residential purchase and sale agreement? Awesome, thank you. All right, so we're just going to kind of chip away. Certain things are going to be kind of obvious, some aren't, but we're going to touch on them anyway. The date, that's going to be the day you write this offer. By the way, this is going to be the controlling date for every form you use going forward. I'm going to quickly switch to another form. Let's go to financing. It says here, the following is part of the purchase and sale agreement dated. Well, that's that date in the upper left-hand corner right here, okay? So that's the date that's going to happen. That'll happen even if you do a Form 34 3 weeks from now. Form 44 is a blank addendum, or maybe you're negotiating something else. And it's going to be a brand new form to your transaction. It's going to use the date that we put in here. In this case, it would be today's date, most likely. Here we'll fill in an MLS number. If there's not an MLS number, like if it's for sale by owner, if you're doing a unlisted sale for some reason, that's fine, leave it blank. Offer expiration, you need to put in a day, a date when the offer is going to expire. So say if I made an offer this morning, maybe I want it to expire today. Maybe I want to put a little pressure on the seller to accept my offer. I would have to put today's date in. By default, it will expire at 9 p.m. today. So if the seller doesn't accept my offer in full by 9 p.m. today, and they accept it at 9:02 p.m. today, that's actually a counter offer, and my buyer has the right to say yes or no, because it was effectively off the table as of 9 p.m. If you leave this blank, it's automatically going to be 2 days. We're going to find out later in the language that any period of time that is 5 days or less does not include weekends or holidays. So 5 days from today would be next Tuesday. Actually, excuse, if we left it blank, I'm sorry, I went off on a different direction there. If we left this blank, it's going to default to expire 2 days from now. So that would be, today is day 0. Okay, the day of the event, and that is us making an offer, is the event. There can be other events as well, but the day of the event is day 0. So day 1 would be tomorrow, Wednesday. Day 2 would be Thursday. So Thursday at 9 p.m. if I leave this blank. I can also fill it in with a date. I could put in, tomorrow. Tomorrow would be the 18th. So I could put in 9/18/2024, and then I could put in noon or 3 p.m. or something like that. You can put in a specific date and time here if you want to, but just know that everything expires if it's blank 2 days from now at 9 p.m. And if you do put an expiration date in there and no time, it expires at 9 p.m. on that date. All right, moving on to buyer. That's going to be obvious. That's going to be whoever your buyer or buyers are. If you have more than 2 buyers, then you can use a Form 2022Z, which is additional buyer form. Those buyers are going to be agreeing to everything in your contract without signing every single page of your contract. Okay, so that's like, maybe you'll have parents involved sometimes, or maybe you've got multiple parties who are investing together. It can vary. For the most part, though, you're going to be dealing with 1 to 2 people. That's, again, the majority of your transactions are going to be 1 person or 2. Here's the status, and that's where you can fill in. You can see there's a drop down here. So, if it's unmarried persons, if you've got a bunch of different parties that are not married, then you can put that in. Married as a separate property. That's if, say, a woman wants to buy it without her spouse. And then you can buy separately. Selling is a different thing. Title companies are going to jump on you to make sure that the other party doesn't have a legal right to the property anyway. But anyway, that's just something to talk to title about when you are listing a property where where the parties are married and only one of them is listed on the deed. So anyway, you can fill this in accordingly as needed when you need to. Legal description attached as Exhibit A. Okay, we don't have a legal description to show you, but when you get your legal description from your title company, typically it's going to say across the top, Exhibit A, because the title company has cleared it. Sometimes you're going to see a legal description that doesn't say that. It might be the last known deed. Generally okay, but the contract calls specifically for a legal description attached as Exhibit A. So try to get that. Ask the title company for it. This, by the way, this goes for both the selling side and the buy side. Hopefully the seller or the listing broker has gotten the legal description that is an Exhibit A by ordering title early. Tax parcel numbers. Most homes are going to be on 1 tax parcel, but every once in a while they're on 2. Every once in a while they're on 3. The most I've seen is on 20. So it was basically one party was selling. They've got a house that's built on a couple of parcels, and then there's a whole gigantic horse property with the rest of it. They wanted to sell it all together. The problem is that you have to list all of the tax parcels, or else you're only buying the ones that you list here. So as a buyer's broker, you want to look online and make sure that the property is not multiple tax parcels. The address is important. We need a physical address. So what's going to happen here is your title company is going to review the legal description. They're going to review the tax parcel numbers, and they're going to look at the physical address, and they're going to look at the seller name. Those things have to all line up. Otherwise, they're going to raise some questions as to whether or not the property is really marketable or not. Are we dealing with the right property? Are we dealing with the right sellers? Do the sellers have the right to sell whatever is being described here? So they'll compare all of that. And again, most of the time it all lines up and it's very easy. It's when they don't line up that it can be a problem. So You as a buyer's broker want to be sure that your title company has all this information because you want your buyer to be assured that they're buying the property they think they're buying. All right, moving on to number 5. If you do not check this box, even if it's included with the sale, your buyer is not entitled to it. The seller does not have to leave it. And we're going to find out there's certain things that are built into cabinetry and things like that. Like there can be a built-in oven. That's when you see a bank of cabinets, and quite often it's a double oven. There's 2 ovens that are built into the cabinet, one above the other. Those are automatically included with the sale, but I would still check this box saying that you want the stove and range. If the cooktop is built into the countertop, quite often that's going to be separate from the oven, where the oven's at, because the oven's built in as well. That again is going to be automatically included with the sale. It's guaranteed to be there when you close. But I still check this box to be safe. But if it's one of those, like I think most of us have in our home, and it's the oven that also has the cooktop built in, it slides in between a bank of cabinets. You can slide it out, you can unplug it, you can undo the gas line, whatever it might be. That one you always need to check this box, because if you don't check it, the seller doesn't have to leave it behind. Same thing, refrigerators, same thing. There can be built-in refrigerators, like Sub-Zeros are frequently built into the cabinetry. Those are included in the sale by default, but that said, I'd still check the refrigerator box. But if it's the typical refrigerator that you buy at Home Depot or Best Buy or one of those places, and it slides in and out of the wall, between cabinets, that kind of thing, that's not automatically included unless you check this box. If the seller did not include, say, the refrigerator or the washer and dryer, now in this case on the listing it said that they did, but say they did not put that on the listing, say all it said was a stove and range, and that's it. Then if you check this box, they can counter you, and they can say no, that they're not going to include that. Maybe they're going to take them with them. We see that with washers and dryers more often than anything. But so if you check it and they didn't include it, if they don't uncheck it, and there was a washer and dryer on the premises, then the seller is required to leave it behind, and your buyer should anticipate that it would still be there when they close on the property. Okay. So hopefully that all makes sense. Essentially, if you check it, the seller has to leave it. But if it didn't exist in the first place, if there was no washer and dryer, the seller doesn't have to go purchase a washer and dryer, even if you ask for it. Okay. It has to be in or on the property in order to be an included item. But if you check it here and it is in or on the property, they do have to give it to you unless they counter it by unchecking it or crossing it off, that kind of thing. Purchase price. This is going to be, we're going to have 2 different things here. So we've got a numerical. So let's say, I don't remember what the price was, but it was, let's just say it was $500,000 that we're going to offer. Okay. We want to do it numerically. And we want to do it longhand. The reason being is that, especially when the offers are handwritten, you can have discrepancies on how a number is read. There are people who get a little careless or quick, and a 0 can look like a 6, or a 4 can look like a 9, a 7 can look like a 2. I mean, we've seen all kinds of things that way. If you do it numerically, and then you write it out longhand, and this includes if you're doing counter offers or anything like that, I still want you to write it out both ways on the price. It's really important. It's going to save you a lot of grief. It could save all kinds of battles down the road. So make a habit out of that. Speaking of habits, I want you to, if there is a blank While I'm not going to say that you have to fill in every blank, if there's a blank, I want you to look at that blank and say to yourself, should I fill this in? And if not, why? Okay. Um, and the reason being is that any blank you don't fill in is looked upon by the buyer as not important, and they won't read that area and they won't pay attention to it. So even default number of days and things like that, um, I I would encourage you to fill them in, because again, you don't want the buyer saying, well, I didn't know, my broker didn't tell me it was important, or didn't tell me at all, whatever it might be. Um, when things go wrong, fortunately, things go right more often than not. It's when things go wrong that communication is key. And the things that you do or don't communicate are the things that brokers get sued for. So if you fill it in, it's harder for them to say, I didn't know. All right. Earnest money. There is no rule on earnest money. People call me all the time asking how much earnest money should we put in. The rule of thumb is 1 to 3%. It seems like sellers are fine with somewhere in that range. The big thing is it's got to be enough earnest money that the seller feels as though they are safe in taking their home off the market. That if you were to terminate your contract, if your buyer were to terminate their contract for no contractually legal reason, that earnest money would go to the seller. And the seller wants to be assured that if you were playing games with them, if your buyer was not serious about buying the home, or if the buyer didn't have all their ducks lined up, that the seller would still get something for the time away there. We see a lot of different amounts of earnest money put in. Like I say, 1 to 3% is typically enough. If you're in competing multiple offers, it may need to be more. There's going to be times where a seller may want your buyer to make their earnest money non-refundable and release it to the seller. Those are two separate things, but they often go together. Release it to the seller means you're letting the seller have the money now or on a specified date in your contract. Once they have that money, it's really hard to get them to give it back, even if they are legally required to. So I'm not a big fan of releasing earnest money for that reason, because, like I say, it can be hard to get it back. If they go out and buy a car with that, or they throw it, if they put it into earnest money on the home they're looking to buy or something like that, it's hard to tap. You can't just grab it from them, that kind of thing. If they make it non-refundable, then that's even more pressing, in that it doesn't matter even if your buyer has the legal right to terminate the contract. They're not going to get their earnest money back, and they need to know that. We have language that we want to give you. So we don't post it anywhere where it's freely available. Honestly, we want you to talk to your manager before you make earnest money non-refundable and released. We have a form for it. Non-refundable earnest money by law has to become a non-refundable deposit, and it is no longer earnest money. We've got language for that. Because earnest money by law is always refundable. Like I say, we've got specific language that we want to see used there. And again, part of having specific language is your buyer can't say they didn't know, because they have to sign a form that's very specific. So talk to your manager if you're ever doing non-refundable or released earnest money. We'll give you that form. Delivery date. This one defaults, according to the form language, to 2 days. You can put in more than that. And the default is of the earnest money is, when does it have to be delivered? Delivered means in the hands of the escrow company, or you're going to see language on here talking about a closing agent. The closing agent is the escrow company. It can also be a closing attorney. There are attorneys who do this stuff every once in a while, who handle escrow. But anyway, the earnest money has to be delivered within a certain number of days. The buyer can hand you, their broker, the earnest money. You have to give them a receipt. That's a Form 89. And you have to get it to escrow within 2 days after mutual acceptance instead. So if you're writing out a contract with your client and they hand you over an earnest money check for $10,000, you would hold that. And as soon as their offer is accepted, then you would take it to the escrow company. I don't recommend that, by the way. When you take hold of the earnest money check, say you've set it on the seat of your car and you inadvertently roll down your window and it blows out onto the freeway in the middle of the night on a wet day. Okay, that check is gone. Well, what if that check was due immediately? Then that's a problem. If it's a cashier's check, those are hard to get a stop on and then get reissued. There's a lot of things that can come up. When it's in your possession, it puts you at a much higher level of responsibility for that money. And if something happened to that check, you could actually create a situation where your buyer would not get the house. The seller can terminate if the buyer doesn't deposit the earnest money by the deadline, which for contract purposes, day 2 in this case would be Thursday at 9 p.m. But we've got the additional little hurdle that escrow companies typically close by 5 p.m. So you have to have it at the escrow company by 5 p.m. The preference is that your buyer delivers it themselves to the escrow company. If they're going to mail it, add some extra days here because it can take longer. Even overnight mail can take. They don't absolutely guarantee it necessarily. And I've had unfortunate things happen where somebody was out of town and they FedExed their earnest money in, and something happened where it didn't get there in time. You can get an extension. You have to write up a form and get it agreed upon by the buyer and the seller. But the easiest thing is just have your buyer hand deliver it to the escrow company prior to 5 p.m. on the delivery date, and extend the delivery date as long as you need to. You can put in, if you're going to mail it, put in 7 days. Give it time to get there, because if it doesn't get there, the contract. It's one of a couple of reasons where a seller can actually terminate the contract legally. For the most part, sellers cannot terminate. All right, the next line is to be held by. You as a buyer broker for Skyline Properties, and most of the companies I know out there will never check this first box because the buyer brokerage firm has to have their own safe account where they can put the funds. We don't have one of those. We don't have a trust account, so we don't do that. So you're going to check closing agent. Closing agent means escrow company. It can mean an attorney. There are, depending on where you're at, there can be other parties that can be a closing agent, but the closing agent is typically going to be a company, and there may be an individual working for it. We'll get to that in a second here. I prefer you don't use promissory notes. If there's a need for a promissory note, it usually means your buyer is not terribly liquid, and if they're not liquid, why? And how's that going to affect them in the contract? Sometimes you can do a promissory note where maybe you want to get through the feasibility study or get through the inspection before you deposit earnest money. Those are kind of special cases, usually involves investors. In that case, a promissory note is fine. But again, I'd like you to talk to your manager before you use those. Okay. Default. This is what's going to happen if your buyer terminates the contract without a contractually legal reason. So you're going to check forfeiture of earnest money as the default. You never want to check seller's election of remedies, because that means the seller can sue your buyer for something other than the earnest money, and that could be something more. So don't want to get your buyer tied up in that. So always check forfeiture of earnest money. Title insurance company, in this case, it was Fidelity, and there are drop downs within these that you can choose. Oops. Mine's not working very well here for some. There we go. So, we can check Fidelity National. Oops, I clicked on the wrong one. You can also just type it in if you wish. Um, there we go. And then this next box is if the listing broker posts the title number, then they can put it in here. So sometimes they've already got a file number for it. So you can post that over here. The next line is going to be for the closing agent, otherwise known as the escrow company. And I want to emphasize company right here. Okay, whoops. Versus individual. Okay, individual is going to be the closer. So we see that wrong quite often where they put the closer name here as the closing agent because they see the word agent and they think of a person. But the closing agent is actually a company. So in this case, we'd put in Fidelity, and I don't remember the name. It was somebody person. I know her last name was person. I think it was Jolene, maybe. Not that it matters. Okay, so that's where I could put the closer name in. By the way, the closing agent and the title company do not have to be the same. The title company is going to be chosen by the seller more often than not. It's actually going to be the listing broker, but for all intents, it's the seller. They will begin doing research on the title so that they can ensure the marketability of the title. If they deem that the title is not marketable, then you won't be able to close. But anyway, that's going to be researched by, in this case, Fidelity. If you wanted to write in somebody else, so say you want to write in First American or Rainier Title or one of the others, if you do that, your buyer may be required to pay a separate title insurance fee to Fidelity because Fidelity's already begun the work. So for the most part, you're going to use the title company that the seller has noted in their listing. Closing agent, on the other hand, the buyer is entitled to choose anybody they want. I know a lot of investors and builders and things like that want to use a specific escrow company because they've got a relationship with a closer, and it's somebody who they know they can communicate well with, whatever it might be. If you don't have any objection to, in this case, using Fidelity, sure, you can do that. It costs a little less to have the same escrow company as title company. If you have a different closing company or closing agent, then there's what's called a sub escrow fee, and that can be charged to the buyer. But we have a relationship with a company called In-House Escrow, and the owner of In-House Escrow is actually a licensed real estate agent with Skyline Properties, and we work with them a lot. We don't have a financial agreement with them, but it's just they are convenient. They're kind of cool company in that they pay for a warranty for the buyer if you use them, so it's free. That's kind of nice. But if you were to put in-house escrow on this line, there's a couple of others out there. Can't think of the names of them off the top of my head, but you can fill those in here as well. And if you do that, that's fine. If the seller has any objection to that, they'll cross it off and counter you back. But a lot of times the seller or the listing broker has an attachment to a closer. That's the reason they put that on there. When you're in multiple offer situations, you may want to think twice about putting things that the seller will counter, because the more things you put to be countered by a seller, the more likely they're going to choose a different offer where they don't have to counter things. My recommendation there is, because there's a good chance your buyer doesn't have any clue who the closing agents are, who the closers are. So it'd be your opinion or your desires there. Don't let those get in the way of your client's ability to get their offer accepted by the buyer or the seller. Closing date. This is the day that it's going to close. Closing is defined as the money is available to all the parties. In other words, the loan has transferred, and then the escrow company and title company have paid the seller. They've paid off any existing loans, any liens, any of that stuff. Okay, so the money is available. It doesn't mean the money is finalized in its transfer. Sometimes wire transfers can take overnight, things like that. It just means that that the money is basically in progress. It means the escrow company has received it and they've begun dispersing it. They've written the checks, they've sent off the wires, that kind of thing. Then it also has to record with the county. There are times when the King County has been notorious for this, especially like on Fridays where they get too many closings come in and they can't record all of them on that day, and it gets pushed to the next day. Oh, that can be a problem. Talk to your title company if that happens, because they will typically guarantee the closing anyway, and even though it hasn't recorded. And if need be, you can get the buyer and the seller to agree upon a there's a form that basically changes the definition of closing to mean that it has been that the documents have been given to the county for recording. They just haven't recorded yet, because it's pretty much just it's a given that it's going to close once that happens. I've never in my career heard of title rejecting, or excuse me, the county rejecting the title's recording. Possession date. Typically, this is going to be on closing, and that's easy. Sometimes a seller wants to stay post-closing, maybe for days, maybe for weeks, hopefully not months. And in that case, you would click Other instead of on closing. And there's two forms you might use. If the seller is staying after closing, it's a Form 65B. So I'd say C. And that means the seller basically becomes a tenant to your buyer when they become the owner. They become the landlord. There's also a Form 65A, and that is when you allow the seller, or excuse me, allow the buyer to move in prior to closing. By the way, I'm not a big fan of either of these. There's insurance issues that can come up. There's a handful of what ifs. What if the seller never moves out? All of a sudden you got a tenant you need to evict. What if the buyer moves in early and it doesn't close? Then again, you've got a tenant you need to evict. It can be hardship. So if you are ever going to do that, make sure you've considered all those options. Make sure that everybody is really solid. Okay, make sure it's not a hardship situation that's forcing them to either stay late or move in early.
So sorry about that. There is a
Yeah.
Form 65A. Another one is
65B.
okay.
65A is when the buyer moves in early. 65B is when the seller stays after closing.
Great, thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, next line. Charges and assessments levied before but due after closing. That's a big sentence there. These are going to be things that the seller knows about. In other words, they've been levied, either a charge or an assessment. Assessments are usually on HOAs or condominiums. Charges can be things that come from the county or other parties that, again, the seller knows about them. They're going to follow the house, and the payments, whether it's all or some of the payments, are due after closing. If you're in King County, the most common one is the King County Sewer Capacity Charge. That stays with the house typically for 10 years, first 10 years of the life of the home. So if it was built in 2022, there's going to be a King County Sewer Capacity Charge attached to that home if it's attached to sewer. And that is it's an additional sewer fee that's charged separately. And like I say, it runs out after a certain period of time. But anyway, you want to think about those things, find out about those things. If it appears, and by the way, it says on the seller disclosures, there's a line where it says, are there any charges or assessments that are due after closing? And that's a good place to start. If you're representing a buyer. So in representing a buyer, I personally, unless I'm in a multiple offer situation where we've got to be really aggressive, I'm going to ask the seller to pay these things off at closing. Okay, my buyer doesn't need to assume any additional payments or any assessment fees or any of that. And by checking it, if you don't know if there's any charges or assessments, and the seller counters you by checking assumed by the buyer, meaning the buyer will just take on the payments after closing, it gives you a chance to ask questions and find out what those are. How much are they? How often are they going to get billed these things? So it's a good negotiating point. So utilize that one according to who you're working with and what you know about the situation. FERPTA, in this case, we didn't get a chance to open up and look at the FERPTA document, but most of the time it's the FERPTA document. That is, by the way, that's the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. The seller has to declare, are they or are they not an alien for a non-resident alien for purposes of U.S. taxation. Okay, so here this is an abbreviated version of it, and more often than not, it's going to say the seller is not a foreign person for purposes of U.S. income taxation. But when you look at that Form 22E that was attached to this listing, we didn't get a chance to open it up and look at it, but we would know it would say either are or are not. Same thing, basically. Is not and are not means that they are citizens of the U.S. and they pay taxes. Is means they are not most likely residents of the U.S. or citizens of the U.S. and they don't pay U.S. taxes. Okay, so the seller has to declare that. If the seller says is or are, then your buyer will need to contact an accountant to get a couple of forms taken care of to make sure your buyer doesn't get stuck with the taxes that the seller is going to incur upon selling the home. Information verification period. This is where on a listing or on the disclosures or anything attached to the listing, there will be basically things that tell about the property and their information about the property. The buyer has a certain period of time. 10 days is the default on the contract. We'll see that later on. But we would, if your buyer, if they check this box and write in 10 days, your buyer has 10 days after mutual acceptance to go over everything in the listing and make sure that it's accurate. And if it is inaccurate and it has a financial value, meaning it's materially inaccurate, your buyer has a right to terminate. The more you put here, the more that sellers become alarmed. Even if the seller thinks they put everything accurate, they don't want to give your buyer any kind of a free pass to get out. There's been some argument when a listing says that a home, it's a quiet neighborhood, and then the buyer goes there a couple days later and discovers there's dogs barking and babies crying or horns honking, who knows what, and they've decided, wait, this is not a quiet neighborhood. Well, quiet can be very subjective. And it can basically, it could mean crime-free and really, really happy to one person, and to another person, it means there's no barking dogs and no crying babies or whatever it might be. That one, it's hard to put a value on that though. So is it materially inaccurate?
Is this
hard to prove that. Go ahead, Jennifer.
So is this the way, I mean, like, if the buyer change mind, like back off the offer, so can we say like, if I not like satisfied with the neighborhood, like, yeah, something like
Well,
that?
you can put in shorter number of days, but then there's a box right here, satisfied or waived. So as soon as you check that, then what that's saying is that your buyer is not going to even try to terminate based on the information verification. So information verification can include square footage, where the seller says it was 2,000 square feet, and then your buyer discovered somehow, some way that it was actually only 1,500 square feet. That is materially misleading. Okay, that 500 square feet is a lot. If it was 10 square feet or 50 square feet, probably not. But hundreds of square feet, yeah, that can be material, meaning it can affect the value. Because it's a matter of inches in a house can change the square footage by 10 or 20 or 30 square feet. All it takes is a couple of inches in every direction, and it can change everything in a big way. So we don't sweat that too much. It's really about, and in court, judges have ruled that, no, you saw the house, you saw how it was used, you saw what it was, you didn't measure it, but you weren't, it's not about it being an X number of square feet. It's about the use of the home, and you were satisfied that the space was acceptable to you for the price you offered. So judges, courts have proven that the square footage isn't as big a deal as we make it out to be, but appraisers will call it out, that kind of thing. Another thing that can come up is material of the home. So say if they, or newness of things on the home. Say they said it had a brand new presidential roof. Well, that's a really high-end roof. It can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And nobody looked at the roof on day one, but then you're driving by and they happen to notice, wait a minute, that roof looks really worn out and it just looks like regular 3-tab. Well, that would be materially misrepresented, inaccurate. So that may have a financial value difference, and your buyer has the right to terminate based on that.
If
Is that helping?
Yeah, if my buyer doesn't mention, I mean, which one I should, you will recommend me to like check? So satisfied, waiver, waived, or like put the dates on there?
The transactions that I'm reviewing lately, and a lot of them are involved in multiple offer situations, which is a little more aggressive. Most of them are checking satisfied, waived. But I do see a few where they click expired. If you leave the box blank, it's going to be 10 days. If you are going to put something in, make it as short as possible to give the seller assurance that you're not looking for an easy out after, they want to know that you're sticking around. That's assuring a seller of that can make the difference in whether or not your offer gets accepted.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, definitely talk to your buyer about it. Tell them about how that works. And there is language about it later on in the form that explains the information verification period. All of these things have language. And a lot of the things we're talking about, there's language, and we're going to get into those here in a moment.
Thank you.
The representation. So you are representing a buyer because you're writing up an offer. So you check that buyer represented by buyer broker. The seller, if it's a listed property, they have a listing broker. If you are ever, like if it's a for sale by owner and you're representing a buyer, you would use the unrepresented seller if they didn't have an agent. You will never, because Skyline does not allow dual agency, you'll never check these two boxes in the middle. Okay, it's always, if there's one party that's not represented, you cannot represent them. Okay, so if you have a listing and a buyer comes through, and that buyer wants you to write up an offer, and you say, you know what, I can't represent you. And they say, that's okay. I know what I want to offer. I just need you to write it up. Then you can do an unrepresented one. If you're dealing with an unrepresented party, please contact your manager or myself so that we can guide you through the steps. There's a few things that we want you to do so that the other party doesn't inadvertently think that you are representing them. Okay, because then you could end up in an inadvertent limited dual agency. So we want you to use forms in a certain way so that that is never an issue. But 90% of everything you write up is going to look like this. It's going to be the buyer represented by a buyer broker and the seller represented by a listing broker. All right, compensation. I know Joe was on my Thursday call this week, and I don't know if the rest of you were or not. This is a hot button right now. This is a big deal. So on this listing, the seller was offering 2.5%. Okay. So we're going to put percent, and we're going to put the seller's offer is 2.5%. Now it comes down to what did our buyer offer to pay us on this listing? or on helping them find a home, excuse me. So I'm going to quickly switch over to Form 41. This is a very important, fairly new form. 41's been around for a while, but it's changed a lot in the last year. And most recently, just 3-4 weeks ago, it changed. In fact, it was 4 weeks ago because it was on August 15th. So it's a brand new form. We're not going to go into this in super depth, but there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that you pay attention to. Since we haven't looked at any addenda or anything like that, anyway, you want to fill in these top areas. Okay, in this case, it's just going to be Skyline and the name of your buyer. And I would leave this blank or put in unlimited for the area. The smaller you make the area, the more likely your buyer can cheat on you and use a different agent to write up their contract. Almost always want to choose exclusive. It could be that your buyer, if sometimes a buyer will be honest with you and tell you that, you know what, for the city of Seattle, I'll use you, but you know what, over in Bellevue, I'm going to use this other one. I've already signed a contract for Bellevue, but I'm going to use you over here. It's up to you as to whether or not you want to agree to those types of terms. But if you do, you can choose non-exclusive. That means they can use other people. Okay, but for the most part, you're going to choose exclusive. They're going to use you and nobody else. By the way, they can you on a moment's notice. All they have to do is call your manager and say, I don't want to work with that broker anymore. And we are obligated under DOL rules to release them from that particular broker. It's more complex than that, but that's the basics. Here where it says limited dual agency, we do not allow limited dual agency, so therefore leave all of this blank, or better yet, even you could fill in NA on the buyer's initials, or cross it off would be a good way to do it too. But here we get into the part, this is the new meat right here, okay, compensation. Your buyer has to offer you compensation or you can't receive compensation from the seller. So when you first meet with your buyer, you're going to negotiate with your buyer and tell them, look, you know, my intention is not for you, buyer, to have to pay me. And most of the listings out there are offering to pay me from the seller's proceeds. And most buyers understand that the seller's proceeds are actually coming from the buyer in the way of down payment and their lending and that kind of thing. So it's ultimately the buyers making this payment. This is the reason there was the big lawsuit. We won't get into that in a big way here, but NAR and several big brokerages were sued in a class action suit because buyers and sellers didn't understand what was going on with the money, how their brokers were being paid. You know, it's pretty obvious to most of it, but unfortunately, they were able to make a case that they didn't understand it, that it wasn't transparent, and maybe in different states or different areas, it wasn't so transparent, and they got sued and they lost. So now we're fixing that. We're going to make sure it's transparent. So we have to tell the buyer, this is what you're agreeing to pay me. So in this case, you know, 2.5% is 60+% of all listings, or 2.5%. So our buyer's pretty safe filling in 2.5%. If if you were to see a listing that was offering less than 2.5%, then you can negotiate it, but it also could mean that you're limited to that. So say they're offering 2%, you'd be limited to asking for that potentially. Your buyer would then have to pay you 0.5%. Your buyer may not want to pay you 0.5%. Maybe your buyer's got every penny they've got is going to be tied up in their down payment and their closing costs and that kind of thing, buying new furniture. They really can't afford to pay their broker. Well, I've highlighted a line here as to why we need the buyer to fill in something here. And that is, the firm may not receive any compensation for brokerage services provided to the buyer from any source greater than the amount set forth in Section 5 or any subsequent amendment hereto. So say your buyer said, I'm not paying you. We're putting 0 there. I'd have a hard conversation with my buyer and say, well, you know what, I can't get paid by a seller unless you offer me something. But I tell you what, we're gonna go, you know, case by case with the listings out there. And if we come across a listing that's offering 2% or 2.5%, or 3% or whatever it might be, I would like you to sign on a subsequent form. That would be a subsequent amendment. We're going to pop over to that form 41A. We're here on part 5, where we could do a subsequent amendment saying that our buyer is indeed going to pay us, in this case, 2.5%. Whoops. Okay, that way I can get my 2.5% from the listing side. If I don't have one or the other of these saying 2.5%, then on my form 21, I'm not going to get that 2.5%. But so say there can be other things. And by the way, we have separate classes that we do on form 41. But if my buyer is offering on form 41 to pay me 2%, and the seller is offering 2.5%, well, I can go ahead and do 2% and then say that the other 0.5% is going to go to my buyer. Then I have to include a form 41C. That's a whole different form. So this can get a little bit complex. What I want you to do, number one, know that you have to fill in A. What is the seller offering? It can say a percentage. It can say request in offer. And in that case, you have to request it, and the seller can counter it. If the seller is offering 2.5 and you request 2.5 and your buyer is offering you 2.5, it can't be countered. Okay, that is just going to happen. That's the rule. But if there's any deviation between this and this, then if the amount the seller is offering versus the amount to be paid by the seller, if there's a deviation there, part of it could be because the buyer is offering a different amount here or here. And it could be that the seller is not making their offer known. You can call the listing broker and say, hey, what's the intention of the seller? What are they intending to offer? And if they intend to offer 2.5, you can, put in 2.5 here. Okay,
But
and
if
go
my
ahead
buyer
and
asked
run
me
with it.
to
Go ahead.
rebate,
What, Jennifer?
sorry
What was
about
that?
that. Sorry about that. So if my buyer like ask for the rebate,
That's a separate addendum.
okay.
Okay, that's not a buyer credit from the seller. Okay, that's a credit from you. So
But they
so
need
that's
like
gonna be
this rebate to cover.
that's gonna be a form 90 between you and your buyer, and it's gonna say buyer's broker agrees to provide buyer closing costs in the amount of blank from the buyer brokerage compensation. Okay, there's different ways you can write that, but you want to be fairly complete. It's coming from you. It's coming from your compensation. This is what's going to be paid by the seller. Now, if you can, if your buyer put in, say, 1% here, okay, but the idea is that the buyer is going to receive credit from you, then you would write in 1% here. Okay, so there's two different scenarios. One is your buyer's going to get some of the commission back from the seller because the buyer didn't agree to provide it to you upfront anyway. Then you check the addendum for buyer credit. But say the seller is offering 2.5 and you request 2.5, then you're going to get 2.5. If you want to give part of that 2.5 to your buyer, that's a separate addendum. Use a form 90 for that.
Okay.
Okay. And the form 90 does not have to be agreed upon by the seller. That's why we recommend you use that instead. Always check with your lender to make sure your buyer can receive closing costs from you. And if you're requesting closing costs from the seller on your form 22A, that can create a problem in that there's only so many closing costs your buyer can get sometimes. So make sure that your numbers are lining up. Check with your lender on that and find out, how much they can receive in closing costs. And then you can juggle your numbers accordingly. Okay, and you can always talk to your manager about those things as they come up. So anyway, this gets a little complex. The one other scenario we haven't talked about yet. So request an offer means that you can put in anything you want here, but it can't be any more than what your buyer has agreed to give you. And then there can be none. Some sellers are going to offer none. If your buyer is just going to pay you, you can leave this blank. Or you could fill it, or you could write in none if you wanted to. If your buyer wants you to at least try to get some money from the seller to pay you, so say your buyer is offering you on their Form 41, 2.5%. You've got a good buyer who loves you and they want you to get paid well. So they put that in there up front. And the seller, though, says, nope, we're not paying a buyer broker. Well, you can still negotiate it, and you could write in 2.5% here. And then if the seller doesn't counter you, the seller's going to pay you 2.5%. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. It's kind of an abbreviated version of everything, but that's what we've been talking about it a lot on our Thursday meetings, and we've had a couple of separate classes. We've got a couple of YouTube recorded classes where another manager and I pretend to be a buyer and a broker, and we're talking through these topics as well. So you might want to watch those separately. Okay, moving on into addenda. These are the forms that you intend to include with your offer. So there's going to be a drop down. My client is getting financing. We want to include a financing addenda. Almost every offer is going to include a Form 22D. The seller is including a Form 22K. By the way, I just realized I skipped a line. Apologies for that. So we missed the where is it? Yeah, services of closing agent for payment of utilities. You're almost always going to check that you want the closing agent to pay any lienable utilities, and that's going to be with a Form 22K. Sometimes on foreclosed homes, bank-owned, that kind of thing, or estates, maybe that's not going to happen. And then you can click waived. But I will say with a lot of confidence, probably 95 or more % of the offers you write will be requesting it with a 22K. Anyway, you can put in the various forms you need. In this case, the seller is including a 22J because his home is older than 1978. And then you want to do an inspection. So there's a trend right now, especially with multiple offer situations, to have people waiving things like inspections or financing or a lot of other things. I don't want you waiving anything by just leaving it out. The reason being is that that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. If you waive inspection by just not including an inspection form, your buyer can say later, I didn't know I could even do an inspection. So in this case, we're planning to do an inspection. We're going to include that form. But say your buyer, say the seller did an inspection on the home up front and they provided a copy to you, and your buyer read that inspection, they're satisfied with it, they don't want to do an inspection. Or say they're up against 7 other offers and all of those other offers are waiving their inspection. Please use Form 35W to waive the inspection. Same thing on like financing. If you are waiving your financing, we'll get into this in a moment here, don't waive it by just leaving a financing addendum out. If they're cash, that's fine. But if they have to get financing, I want your buyer to understand kind of how that looks and what it is they need to do. Because if they're waiving their financing, it means they don't get their earnest money back if they fail to close because of financing. If you've got the financing addendum and you're using it to waive, you're much safer from being told, well, I didn't realize that I was going to lose my earnest money if I didn't close. If the financing didn't work out, that kind of thing. So anyway, there's ways to do things. I want you to talk to your manager. If you don't know how to waive something, please talk to a manager. Don't just waive it by leaving it out. Okay, the biggest things that come up are financing, inspection, the utilities addendum, septic or well. There can be other things, but those are the biggies. Leaving those out can get you sued later on. So don't leave them out. Talk to us and we'll help you get through those. Okay, at the bottom of this form, in this case, you're going to fill in, the buyers are going to sign here. You're going to put in the buyer brokerage firm. In this case, that would be Skyline Properties. The buyer broker, in this case, would be me, Eric Johnson. Put in my phone number, my office. I'm in MLS office number 3353. That's the Kent office. But depending on which office you're in, it'll be different. Your lag number, you know that. Mine is 43357. I would fill that in here. Firm document email address. Skyline@skylineproperties.com is our firm document email address. You're not going to send things to Skyline@skylineproperties.com unless the broker on the other side of the transaction is with Skyline. But otherwise, this is here for their information, but you're going to look at the other side of the transaction if you're a buyer agent and see the firm document email address for the other side. And that's going to be important to you, as is the listing broker email address. The reason I say it's important, when you send your offer or any other addendum to this, any changes to your contract whatsoever, you have to have both email addresses. You have to have the firm. So I know I was dealing with the John L. Scott office recently. So their email address, their firm document email address was responses.kent@johnlscott.com. That was their firm document email address. And then the broker, I can't remember what was her name. It's not coming to me, but anyway, let's just call it Bob Broker. So it's bobbroker@johnlscott.com. Always have two email addresses. If you do not have the broker, if you don't have proof that you sent it to the broker and to the firm, you can't prove you actually even delivered it to them. That's an MLS rule. There's language on, it's approximately page 5 in your purchase and sale agreement that speaks to that. So anyway, just know, get in the habit. If you're not sending it to any form you send has to go to 2 email addresses. Sending it to Skyline@skylineproperties.com does you zero benefit from a Northwest MLS delivery perspective. So don't send it there, or that email box gets filled up fast enough anyway. The only time you'll do it is if the other broker on the other side is with Skyline. So then you'd have to in order to prove it. But otherwise, you're only going to send it to 2 email addresses. If there's multiple agents, you can send it to, like say there's co-listing or something like that. You can send it to all the listing brokers, but be sure you include the firm that they work for. Okay, so a firm and a broker, minimum, 2 email addresses. The other firm, the other broker. Okay, hit that hard. All right. Now we're going to move into some language. And again, I'm not going to read everything. So, oh, by the way, these were called specific terms. Specific means you can change them. You are being specific about what you're asking for. Then we get into what's called the general terms. Okay. And these are things that really are not intended to be changed. Couple things, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier. Be sure and look at your revision date. If you're writing up a purchase and sale agreement, if you get it from the MLS, you're fine. It's got the current revision date. If you get it from them on the day that you're writing it. If you save a PDF to your laptop, or if you print forms and carry them around in the trunk of your car or your briefcase, whatever it might be, those forms could expire. They can be out of date. So I recommend you get them the day that you need them on the MLS. That way you'll know. So in this case, this one was revised on 8/24. I know that's the most current one. And you won't necessarily know it's the most current unless you look at the forms on the MLS. Here, I'll show you on Express Forms. You can see, here's Form 21. It was revised on August of 2024. By the way, if you ever want to learn more about your forms, go to the manual. Okay, these are the manuals. Man 21. That has a lot of extra language that explains parts of your purchase and sale agreement as well, beyond the language of the purchase and sale. It kind of explains the usage. So don't be shy about using those every once in a while too as you get started here. Okay, going back to our PSA, general terms. You'll see that I've highlighted some things. Those are the things we're going to focus on. So if your buyer is paying cash, no problem. That's what this form is for. Okay, it says the buyer shall pay to seller the purchase price, including the earnest money, in cash at closing, unless otherwise specified in this agreement. Second sentence says the same thing, only different. And so buyer represents that the buyer has sufficient funds to close this sale in accordance with this agreement and is not relying on any contingent source of funds, including funds from loans, the sale of other property, gifts, retirement, or future earnings, except to the extent otherwise specified in this agreement. So here it says, for example, including funds from loans. Okay, well, wait, my client is dependent upon, they are relying upon getting funds from loans. Well, that would have to be specified separately in this agreement, and that's the Form 22A, is the financing addendum. Okay, so if you have any of these things going on, sale of other property, that's going to be a Form 22B. That's the contingent upon sale of property. You could also have a 22Q, which is contingent upon closing of a sold property. Gifts from parents, they need to be outlined, or gifts from anybody for that matter. If you're tapping into retirement funds, that's something that you should disclose. If there's any chance, 1% chance that this money is not going to come through, you need to make it into a contingency. Okay, so talk to your manager about that if you're doing that. There's an evidence of funds form. It's a Form 22EF. Not my favorite form because it doesn't give your buyer any right to terminate if the funds don't come through. So say your client was reliant upon retirement funds and the stock market crashed overnight. And all of a sudden their retirement funds have dwindled down to nothing and they no longer have the money to put down on the home. Therefore, the lender is not going to loan them a mortgage. They would effectively, they've breached their contract by not having that outlined somewhere. And they could lose their earnest money if they can't close. If they are going to pull retirement funds, my recommendation is they go ahead and tap into the retirement funds when they start looking for homes. So the money is liquid. If it's liquid, then they don't have to worry about it dissolving overnight. That particularly goes for crypto. It's fine to use crypto for your down payment, but it does change value pretty quickly. We've seen Bitcoin go from it was up as high as like 62,000 a couple of weeks ago, and it dropped down to 55,000 in the meantime. That's a substantial amount of money that could maybe disappear and your buyer couldn't close. And if your buyer can't close because they didn't disclose where the funds were coming from and make it contingent upon those funds, then they could lose their earnest money as well as losing their ability to buy the house. So it's really important to get that right. Most of your clients are going to be relying upon a traditional mortgage, and that's pretty simple. That's a Form 22A. We'll get to that one in a few minutes. Next line I want to focus on is the next one in green. The parties shall use caution when wiring funds to avoid potential wire fraud. For wiring funds, the party wiring those funds shall take steps to confirm any wire instructions via an independently verified phone number and other appropriate measures. You should never, ever, ever, and I can't emphasize it enough because you could be sued for it if you goofed, send the wiring instructions to your client. It's happened. Brokers have been sued. Brokers have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in judgments because they sent the wrong wiring instructions and the money went to another account where it couldn't be retrieved. There's some bad players out there that'll intercept emails and try to convince your buyers to send their earnest money or their closing costs, or excuse me, their down payment to some unknown bank account. This is why we want them to contact the escrow company and say, hey, escrow company, I just got an email from you saying that the account and routing number for wiring my funds is this. Can you please confirm that for me? And in this case, they're talking to, it would be Jolene Person. She was our closer, right? Talking to Jolene, and Jolene would say, read it to me, and you'd read it to her, and then she'd read it back to them. They make complete confirmation that that is the right numbers. Then they can go ahead and do that. Okay, we don't want them wiring funds without having that satisfactory. If they receive a form at the escrow company, maybe when they drop off their earnest money, or they go in there to get the wiring instructions, they get it from somebody at the escrow company, that's going to be safe. We want them though to call the closer otherwise and verify anything they receive by email with those numbers. Super important. We don't want our clients' money to disappear into thin air. You're not going to get paid if your client can't close, and if they can't close if they don't have if their funds get hijacked into somebody's Cayman Island account, and then transferred to another account after that. Okay, moving on here. Next one, B, earnest money. So this one says the buyer shall deliver. That means it's got to be in the hands of the party who's going to receive it. In our case, it's always going to be the closing agent. That's why I've highlighted that in green. The buyer shall deliver the earnest money by the delivery date listed in specific term number 7. It's 2 days after mutual acceptance if not filled in. I'm going to ask you to always fill it in though, so that the buyer can't say they didn't know, because they're not going to read general terms. I'd like them to, but they won't. And they're not going to remember even if they did. Okay. So, and they're going to deliver that to the party holding the earnest money. And in this case, again, it's always going to be the closing agent if you are the buyer broker, because Skyline Properties does not have a buyer brokerage trust account. It goes on to say, if sent by mail, the earnest money must arrive at the buyer brokerage firm or closing agent by the delivery date. So that means that you need to make sure you include enough days to cover that mailing time. I'm going to encourage you to read all of these forms, by the way. Maybe read each paragraph 3 or 4 times and then stop. Read one paragraph one day. Tonight you can read paragraph A, read it 3 times, get to know it, make sure you're comfortable, call your manager if you're not, and then call it a day. Tomorrow, read part B and read it 3 or 4 times. Make sure you're comfortable with it. If you don't understand it, call your manager. But anyway, we're not going to read the rest of this paragraph, because the next line says, if the earnest money is held by the buyer brokerage firm and is over $10,000, well, number one, we don't hold earnest money at our buyer brokerage firm, so we don't have to worry about the rest of it, even if it is over $10,000. That just talks about what's going to happen with interest and where that interest is going to go and everything. And so you don't have to deal with that. The second paragraph, we're not going to talk about right now because it's way ahead of the game for you. Most of the time, you are not going to be dealing with earnest money disputes. They do come up. I'll be honest, they're coming up more lately than they have at any time in my career. Part of that is because the market is hard right now. Part of it is because buyers are making very aggressive earnest money decisions. Sellers sometimes are forcing those aggressive decisions. Anyway, if there is an earnest money dispute, the second paragraph covers it. It's called the interpleader process. I'll quickly, if I can find my mouse, we'll highlight that word for you. So interpleader, okay? It's a legal process, and it involves attorneys, and it involves judges and that kind of thing. It's a very expensive process. If the money is disputed and the parties can't agree upon any type of a compromise, escrow is going to send the money to interpleader at some point. Interpleader is going to cost each party between $5,000 and $10,000 in legal fees. And the winner at interpleader will receive whatever the earnest money is, and they will get their legal fees paid. So make sure that you've got solid arguments if your buyer or seller decides that they're going to fight on the earnest money when they don't have the legal right to do so. Anyway, we'll talk about that someday when you actually get to an earnest money dispute. Hopefully you never, ever go there. Most brokers don't deal with earnest money disputes at least the law that lasts long enough to go into interpleader. So, but if it's getting to that point, please call me or your manager, and we're happy to talk to you about it. All right, really quick, I'm going to bounce back up to specific term number 5. This is where we could itemize the stove. Okay, here it is, specific term 5. The stove, refrigerator, washer, dryer, dishwasher, microwave, etc. On our listing, they included dishwasher, dryer, microwave, refrigerator, washer. So as long as we check those boxes, our buyer is going to get those items. But now moving back down to the language that controls that, and I've highlighted the whole thing because it's all kind of important. Okay, so I'm going to break this up into 2 different sentences. Any of the following items identified in specific term number 5, if the corresponding box is checked, located in or on the property, are included in the sale. Okay, so that says all those things you checked, if they're in and on or on the property, they come with the house unless the seller counters them for some reason. And the seller won't counter you if they intended to leave them behind anyway by listing them in their listing. But here we go. So remember earlier I talked about built-in appliances like the built-in stove or the built-in ovens into the cabinetry, or the stove that's built into the countertop, the refrigerator that's built into the cabinetry. There can be other appliances that are built in. A lot of times the microwave is built into the hood above the oven, even if it's a freestanding oven range. So anyway, that would be included with the house. Technically, you don't have to check the box if that's the case. I check them anyway just to be safe. I'm a little bit of a I would rather have kind of a redundancy rather than make assumptions. All right, let's see. Wall-to-wall carpeting, curtains, drapes, and all other window treatments. So when you show a house that's got curtains or blinds or whatever, your buyer should be able to understand that those are going to be there when they close on the home, and they're not going to have, the master bedroom windows exposed to the neighbors right behind them with no drapes because they didn't know about that. So that's that's the reason that this is an important thing, is that they want to know that they don't have to go out there and order up drapes or blinds or anything in advance, so they can have privacy in the home once they move in. Okay, if the curtains, drapes, and other window treatments are not in place, then they don't come with the house. New construction, by the way, is notorious for that. Be sure you find out if there's going to be a window treatment package with the new construction and get that included, so your buyers don't have to deal with that after closing. Window and door screens, awnings, storm doors and windows, installed television antennas, ventilation, air conditioning, and heating fixtures. So that air conditioner that is in the window is not necessarily included. If it plugs into the wall, it may not be a fixture, even if it's clamped into the window frame or something like that. If it's a freestanding air conditioner or freestanding heater that are on wheels or on the floor and it plugs into the wall, that is not a fixture. If these are important to your buyer, make sure that you check the box up here on number 5 for other, right here, and fill it in. So it could be the AC, oops, that's not there. AC, in bedroom window. If you include it here, check the box and put it here, and the seller doesn't counter you, they have to leave it behind for you, or they owe you one. Mini splits that are attached, they're permanently attached to the wall, and there's usually a duct that runs out the wall and runs down the exterior of the home to a condenser unit. Those are fixtures. Okay, so if it's bolted to the wall and if it's hardwired, probably a fixture. If it plugs in, probably not a fixture. If it can be detached by the, for example, a hose is not an irrigation fixture. But if you've got pipes that are running from the house that you can turn a knob and then it turns on, The sprinkling system, well, that's an irrigation fixture, okay, because it's hard plumbed. But if you can undo it and detach it in any way, shape, or form, it's probably not a fixture. So that goes for light fixtures if they're not hardwired in and bolted into the ceiling or the wall or whatever it might be. If they plug in somewhere and they're hanging from a chain, and that chain can be undone from a hook, it's probably not a light fixture. We go on to trash compactor, garbage disposal, fireplace doors, gas logs and gas log lighters, irrigation fixtures, electric garage door openers, and yes, it includes the remotes. We'll get to that in a moment. Water heaters, installed electrical fixtures, lighting fixtures, shrubs, plants, and trees planted in the ground. So if they're in a pot on the porch, the seller can take it with them, unless it's otherwise noted in number 5 up above. You can say, plants in the pots on the back porch, and then the seller would leave it if they didn't counter that. Then it's got the catch-all other fixtures. And again, fixtures are affixed to the home in some way, not something that can be removed by a simple twist or movement. And then it says in all associated operating remote controls and access permissions. There's a lot of homes that have smart pads these days. And some of them have security systems that require access codes and things like that. That should all be provided by the seller to the buyer if they're staying with the home. Operating remote controls. If there's a TV that is mounted on the wall and it's going to stay, by the way, don't assume that, even though it looks like a fixture, because it's hard, it's mounted hard to the wall. A lot of those mounts could actually be lifted right out, and then you just have to unplug it. So if there's a TV and your buyer wants it to stay with the home, please write it in number 5 up here. Okay. And there would be an example. Okay. TV mounted in living room. Specify it. We don't want to assume these things. And if our buyer wants it, we don't want to look bad because we didn't include it in our offer. Anyway, if there's remote controls associated with that TV or the speaker system or anything like that, a lot of ceiling fans have remote controls. There are some drapery and blind systems that have remote controls. There are heating systems that have remote controls, like those mini splits, for example, quite often have remote controls. Those should all be left behind, and it's assumed that they're going to be left behind, and the seller, it says that they have to here. If they don't leave them behind, then they might want to FedEx them to you because they put them in a box when they moved, or they may want to reimburse for whatever they cost to replace. So keep reading through this. Like I say, there's things in here that I've highlighted that are areas that I want to focus on here for the class. A lot of the other language, it's not that it's not important, it's just maybe you don't need it as intensely. It's more about it's covering some side details that you're not going to necessarily need every single time. But anyway, so get to know it. We're going to skip several paragraphs coming up here, and we're going to barely touch on a couple of the others. So in this one, the big thing here is that the condition of title, unless otherwise specified in this agreement, title to the property shall be marketable at closing. So if for some reason the title company isn't willing to insure the title, that means it's probably not marketable, and they won't allow it to close. And if that happens, the buyer gets their earnest money back. And that's one of my problems when you make earnest money non-refundable, or you release the earnest money. What if that money, what's going to happen? How do you get that money back? So we would like to see that, that is essentially, if it's not marketable, it means the seller has done something. Most likely, it's probably going to be some type of a lien or something like that. IRS liens are notorious for making properties unmarketable. It could be that there's some stuff going back in history, but essentially that is the seller's fault at that point. It may not be that the seller did something horrible and egregious, but it does mean that the seller is legally responsible for that issue. Therefore, the seller should return the earnest money. So, like I say, that's my problem with non-refundable, is that little clause is one of the 3-4 different things that can really come up that are problematic on something like that. The rest of it talks about things that make the property not marketable, and you can read those things. If you have questions about any of those things, please call your manager or call your title company. Title company is a great resource. Get to know your title officer. Title officer and a closer. It's good to have relationships with those people. You can also get to know the title rep. If any of you come to our Thursday classes, we've got a title rep by the name of Scott Farrell who shows up there. He's available. I've worked with so many title reps over my career, and I like them all. They're great people. So I kind of move I share the love, if you will. I talk to several different title reps depending on things that I need to find out. I like to get different theories too, different opinions, because different title companies may have different opinions or different ways that they do it. Moving on to general term E, title insurance. This is the type of homeowner's policy of title insurance for a 1 to 4 family residence. That is what you're going to get. It also goes on to talk about, how the buyer has to buy the seller has to buy the buyer a title policy, and the buyer will buy their lender a title policy. If the buyer is paying cash, the buyer won't have to buy a title policy because the seller's buying it for them. Anyway, that's all kind of broken down. There's more in there, but again, it's not as critical. I'm going to take you really quickly to Form 22D. And we move into the title insurance clause on this. By the way, I want you using 22D on every transaction because of the first paragraph where it says the listing broker and buyer broker make no representations concerning the lot size or accuracy of any information provided by the seller, the square footage. It's protecting you. They can't say that you should have known because you've got a clause right there that says you didn't have to know. There's another clause, by the way, that we'll get to a little later that says even more detail about that topic. But anyway, on the title insurance topic, it says here in the second line, the parties have the option to provide less coverage by selecting a standard policy or more coverage by selecting the extended policy. So you could check one of these. Don't check these unless you know why you're checking it, because one of them is going to give your client less coverage than they're going to get in the ALTA form of homeowner's policy of title insurance that is specified in general term E. And the extended coverage is going to include all kinds of things, including a survey, and surveys can cost thousands of dollars. Depending on the property. I don't recommend extended coverage without talking to the title company first, learning what you can about the property, find out if it had been surveyed anytime recently. If it's a gigantic piece of property or if it's multiple parcels, that's one thing. If it's waterfront, it can be a big deal. In general, your typical home in a typical subdivision is going to be pretty well defined what their property looks like and what the title situation is going to be. So you just stick with that ALTA form of homeowner's policy of title insurance. Standard is less, so they won't look at as much. So your buyer could be buying something, an issue that is not insured. Okay, so there's talk to your title rep or talk to your manager if you're going to choose either of these boxes. And I'm going to tell you that it's very rare that you will check either of these boxes. All right, back to Form 21. Okay, there's a lot of yellow going on here. This is an important topic. This is the closing and possession clause, all the different things. So there's about 4 different topics in this paragraph. We're going to hit on them all. So the first line is the sale shall be closed by the closing agent on the closing date. Okay, so there it is. That's the basic definition of the closing. And then we go on to say if the closing falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a legal holiday, I'm not going to read any of these RCW things, or a day when the county recording office is closed, the closing agent shall close the transaction on the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday, or day when the county recording office is closed. So therefore, you want to be, when you're picking a closing day, look at the calendar. Is it a holiday? Is it a weekend? You know, you can't control that. There might be the rare weird day when the county office recording office is closed because the one employee there is sick, or they have a um, King County gets too many in one day or something like that. Weird things can happen. We had a snow day where King County closed the recording office at midday because the city of Seattle was snowed under and you couldn't even get to the recording office. So, there are weird things that can happen, but for the most part, you're going to know if it's a Saturday, a Sunday, or a legal holiday by peeking at a calendar. Legal holidays are going to be the primary holidays. There's a couple of oddballs out there. Thanksgiving is a weird one in that it's a 2-day legal holiday. Those are days when the county is closed on both Friday or Thursday and Friday at Thanksgiving. 4th of July, Labor Day, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas Day, New Year's Day, and MLK Day, President's Day. Yeah, I think that's all of them. But those are the primary ones. And you can always contact your title rep and they will send you a list of what the legal holidays are so you know what they're going to be for that given year. Like I say, you don't want to accidentally put your closing on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday because it's not going to happen. It'll automatically get moved to the next day that is not. Okay, moving on. Closing means the date on which all documents are recorded and the sale proceeds are available to seller. Remember I said earlier, sale proceeds being available means that the title company has collected them and has begun to disperse them. It doesn't mean that the check has arrived in the seller's mailbox, that kind of thing, or that the wired funds have completely transferred. It may, it depends on banking. What is it? The New York banking hours. So after 2 p.m., a wire transfer may not transfer, and it depends on the banks at both ends. But anyway, it's when they're available. It also says that when they're recorded. If you're ever hitting a situation where they can't record because the county doesn't have the manpower to do it, or they're inundated, or they close inadvertently, or something like that, the title company will give you a guarantee of closing at that point, and you can still consider it closed on that day. But there's a form for that. It's a 22YY, and that's a revision of the definition of closing to say that the documents have been delivered for recording to the county. All right, this one's important. This will come up. By the way, make arrangements with your clients, or excuse me, with the other agent as to how you're going to get the keys several days before closing. Don't wait until closing day to find out that you're going to have to jump through hoops to get the keys or something like that. A lot of times the listing broker will just leave the keys in a key box and you'll tell the listing broker that you've got the keys and then they'll come and take the key box down. Sometimes they'll hide them under a rock. I don't like that one, but that's leaving the property unsecured for a period of time. It could be that the listing broker and you meet somewhere to exchange the keys. It could be that the listing broker takes the keys to their office and you go to their office and pick them up. There's a lot of different ways it can be done. There's no right or wrong, but it does say here, the seller shall deliver keys, garage door remotes, and access codes to the buyer on the closing date or on the possession date, whichever occurs first. So if your closing is today, you're entitled to the keys right now. It doesn't say after it's recorded. It doesn't say after it's closed, because closing technically doesn't happen until 9 o'clock. We'll find out in the next line. So, your buyer is entitled to receive the keys on the closing date. They're not entitled to turn the key until after 9 p.m. or whatever the possession time has been established to be. And that's the next line. Buyer shall be entitled to possession at 9 p.m. on the possession date. Okay, you can write into your contract the possession will be at 5 p.m., that kind of thing. You can change the closing to say a date and a time, and that's how you override that 9 p.m. thing. If it's important to your buyer that they actually begin to start to move in on the day that they close. And for some people that's important. Other ones, they're not going to move in until the following weekend anyway. Let's see. Okay, this is one that there's a lot going on in the next little bit here. The seller shall maintain the property in its present condition. What is present condition? Present condition is the day you wrote the offer. Okay. That's the day you saw the property. That's present condition. Seller shall maintain the property in its present condition, normal wear and tear accepted, until the buyer is provided possession. And that includes if the seller stays after closing. Then they still have to maintain it in that condition. That's the buyer hasn't been provided possession until 2 weeks after closing if the seller is going to retain the home after closing. Goes on to say, the seller shall either repair or replace any system or appliance, including but not limited to plumbing, heat, electrical, and all included items that becomes inoperative or malfunctions prior to closing with a system or appliance of at least equal quality. So if it says in the disclosures that appliance is not working, then that it wouldn't fall here. So say the stove, one of the burners doesn't work on the stove, and they say so in the disclosures, then you're going to be hard pressed to ask for it here later. But if it whether it's working or not, if they don't call it out in that, and if you do an inspection and the burners worked during the inspection, then it's easy if one of the burners isn't working when you do your walkthrough to say that, wait, that burner needs to be repaired, that kind of thing. So anyway, this can be, even if you waive your inspection, you can still ask for things that you find out on your walkthrough are not working because it's the home. It's intended that they are working unless they've disclosed to you very specifically in their disclosures that they don't work. Anyway, seller shall repair or replace any system or appliance that becomes inoperative or malfunctions prior to closing with a system or appliance of at least equal quality. Buyer reserves the right to walk through the property within 5 days of closing to verify that the seller has maintained the property and the systems or appliances as required by this paragraph. Okay, so that's a biggie there. It's important that you do that walkthrough. You're not always going to get a perfect walkthrough. The home may still be occupied. The seller may not move out within 5 days of closing. They may move out on the closing day. There may be boxes everywhere, but you still have the right to go through there and check stuff and see what's working, what isn't working, and hopefully, you can find out what things are not working and actually ask the seller to fix them. Now, one of the big problems with this whole thing is it doesn't say any consequence. The consequence would be, can the buyer refuse to close? Can the buyer terminate if they find problems with a system or appliance that's become inoperative or malfunctioning prior to closing when they check that on their walkthrough? No, they cannot fail to close. They cannot, they don't have the right to terminate or anything like that. They have the right to ask for it, and the seller has the legal obligation to repair it. If the seller doesn't repair it and you've asked for it, you want to ask for it prior to closing because that puts them on notice. Because if you ask for it after closing and you have not told them before closing, then they're not on notice and they can say, nope, that broke after you moved in. So you want to put them on notice that, hey, this is broken, and then they need to fix it afterwards. And if they choose not to, then your buyer has the right to sue them. But your buyer doesn't have the right to terminate or fail to close. They could lose their earnest money if they did that. Talk to your manager if that type of scenario comes up. Okay, let's see. Seller shall not enter into or modify existing leases or rental agreements, service contracts, or other agreements affecting the property which have terms extending beyond closing without first obtaining the buyer's consent. And that consent shall not be unreasonably withheld by the buyer. Then it goes on to talk about Form 65A and 65B and the scenarios in which you would use those. You can read that going forward. The next paragraph talks about the fact that the home needs to be equipped with a carbon monoxide alarm or alarms, depending on the size of the home and the number of floors in the home and that kind of thing. There are rules that carbon monoxide alarms need to be within 10 feet of any bedroom door. So if you have a long hallway you might need 2 carbon monoxide alarms in that hallway. If you've got bedrooms upstairs and downstairs, you may need different ones. But a minimum of 1 per floor and within 10 feet of any bedroom door. Smoke detection is similar, it's just 1 per floor minimum. But again, nothing wrong with having more of them. But anyway, that's the seller and the listing broker should make sure the home has these things because they are required by contract. And you can demand that they put them in later on, like during the appraisal or during the inspection. You might find out they don't exist because appraisers and inspectors call those out. Next paragraph is section 1031, like, kind, and exchange. This is section 1031 of the US tax code. This is for investors. Investors can defer their capital gains taxes if they follow certain rules. We're not going to dig in on this whole paragraph because the paragraph doesn't even start to touch the rules that are involved. This is just notifying that if a buyer is buying a property where the seller is selling it under a 1031, the buyer may have to sign a form or two, but the buyer won't incur any expenses or have any other legal requirements. If you have investors who are interested in deferring their capital gains taxes, I recommend that you contact one of the 1031 exchange providers and find out when their next 3-hour clock hour class is going to be, and take that class and get the clock hours and learn a ton about that type of thing. There's a couple of attorneys out there who also offer 1031 exchange classes. Moving on to closing costs and prorations. This is basically just saying who's going to pay what at closing. Okay, so it breaks it down for you. The buyer and seller shall each pay 1/2 of the escrow fee unless otherwise required by FHA or VA regulations. Taxes for the current year, rent, interest, and lienable homeowners association dues shall be prorated as of closing. The buyer shall pay the buyer's loan costs, including credit report, appraisal charge, and lender's title insurance, unless provided otherwise in this agreement. If any payments are delinquent on encumbrances, which shall remain after closing, the closing agent is instructed to pay such delinquencies at closing from money due or to be paid by seller. Goes on to talk about some other things that aren't as common. The MLS has the right to publish the sale information and distribute that published information to several different parties. We talked earlier about FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. And there's one important thing here, and that is that if you don't know, if you haven't received the Form 22E, your buyer needs to know. Otherwise, your buyer could incur taxes. Fortunately, not very often, but they could. So you want to be sure that you receive that form and that your buyer has the right to talk to a CPA or an attorney too. If the seller fails to provide the FIRPTA certification to the closing agent within 10 days of mutual acceptance, the buyer may give notice that the buyer may terminate the agreement at any time 3 days thereafter. Okay, so if you don't get it within 10 days, you can get your buyer out, especially if there's any feeling whatsoever that your buyer could be on the hook for those taxes, you definitely want to, if the seller is a non-resident alien who does not pay U.S. taxation, they're going to pay 15% of the value of the property in taxes when they close, not the equity, it's a lot, in other words. So on a $500,000 home, you're talking, potentially, what is that, 15%, what, 45? No, it's going to be what, $15,000 or something like that. No, it'd be, I'm wrong there, but anyway, I'm not going to do the math. That said, it's a lot. Okay, 15% of whatever the value of the home is. Then we get into the next one, notice and deliveries. Notices are things that only have to be signed by one party, and it's basically just making a statement that doesn't affect the other party. It's nothing that's negotiable. It's basically saying that, an inspection response can be a notice. And that is when the buyer says, we've done our inspection and we're fine with everything and we're going to move forward to closing. That's a notice. It could be that the buyer does an inspection and they decide they don't want the house anymore and they want to terminate. That's a notice. In other words, the seller doesn't have any say in that. Notices can both go either direction. A seller or a buyer can provide a notice, and it basically isn't something that is negotiable or arguable. And sometimes it does mean the end of the transaction. Let's see. I wanted to move on to the next part, though, and this is where we were talking about the emailing of something and proving delivery. You have to prove that you've delivered a document to the other party. And here it says email transmission of any notice or document or a direct link to such notice or document. When you do AuthentiSign, you're going to get a link to a document. You can click here, and when you click here, it opens up a PDF. You can forward that if you want to. Anyway, that's the direct link part. So anyway, email transmission of any notice or document shall constitute delivery when the email is sent to both the buyer broker and buyer brokerage firm, or both the listing broker and listing brokerage firm at the email addresses specified on page 1 of this agreement. So like I said earlier, get in the habit of sending any form you're sending to another agent, send it to their firm at the same time. And that firm will be listed on the listing most often, but you can also look it up on the roster through the Northwest MLS. The other thing that you can have happen, say you forget to include the brokerage firm, and you call the other broker and say, hey, would you please respond? I need an acknowledgement that you received that. That's the second part. Buyer broker or listing broker provide written acknowledgement of receipt of the email. Okay, and then finally, if a party is unrepresented, the email is sent directly to the party's email address specified on page 1 of the agreement. So there you go. That's what you have to do to prove that the other party got it. Okay, computation of time can get a little confusing. Basically, if it's measured in days, in other words, if you write in the number of days in a blank, then those days are going to be measured in a certain way. So if you write in 5 days or less, that 5 days does not include weekends or holidays. If you write in 6 days or more, it does include weekends and holidays, but it cannot end on a weekend or holiday. Anything, any period of time ends at 9 p.m., although it can start at a time later than 9 p.m. That gets a little confusing sometimes, but everything expires at 9 p.m. unless otherwise stated. So say we write up an offer today and it's accepted today, we've got a 5-day inspection. Okay, we effectively have until next Tuesday at 9 p.m. to provide the seller with our inspection response. The seller will then have 3 days to respond to it as well. So those are all periods of time that don't include weekends. And they all end at 9 p.m. But the fact that I send it today at 11:59 means 2 minutes later is when that time period starts. So it's the event commencing the period. That's the day that you send it, okay, or the day that that something expires. Is the day that's day 0. Okay, that's the day commencing the period. So if I send an offer today at 11:59 p.m. and I put down that it expires in 1 day, that means it's going to expire tomorrow at 9 p.m. If I send it at 12:01 a.m. tonight in the morning, then the following day won't start until and I put down for 1 day, it's not going to happen until the following day. So tomorrow's Wednesday would actually be Thursday if I send it at Wednesday at 12:01. Okay, but if I send it on Tuesday at 11:59, 2 minutes earlier, it's a whole day earlier on the expiration time. Okay, if you're putting in the number of days, if you put a specific date, it's going to happen on that specific date at 9 p.m. Okay, so that's the basics of this paragraph. It's there's a lot going on in this paragraph. Again, I want you to read it and read it and read it, get to know it. But don't be embarrassed if you have to call me or one of our managers and ask about periods of time. It can get a little confusing. The best example I know of is Thanksgiving. So if I write an offer on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and I put in 5 days for my inspection to expire, it's actually going to be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and that's it. So we've got 9 days is when 5 days expires. Okay, so that's around Thanksgiving because that 4 days for the weekend and the holiday, and then the 5 days. So that's day one doesn't even happen until Monday. So there's that. If I put in 10 days, then it'll expire on the Saturday, a week plus after Thanksgiving. But it'll move to the following Monday after that weekend. Okay, so that's just one example of where this can get a little complex, but you can also use it strategically sometimes too to give a little extra time for your buyer to maybe do their inspection. If you write in 7 days or 9 days on the inspection, the seller's going, that seems like a long time. If you write in 5 days, if they haven't read this paragraph, they think that 5 days is quick, but it actually gives you 9. So anyway, use those things strategically. It can, and call me anytime you want to talk about these dates. I talk to brokers about them all the time. It can get a little convoluted every once in a while. That includes when you get an offer where maybe you're not sure of where things are going to end. And there's a lot of time periods within your contract. There's a number of days to when you have to turn in the earnest money. That is 5 days or less. And so therefore it's going to happen on a weekday. Technically it expires at 9 p.m., but the problem is the escrow company closes at 5. So you gotta meet those deadlines. There's going to be, you get 3 days to review the disclosures if you haven't waived them. That again is less than 5 days. If it happens, you can get extra days on that. Inspection lending has lots of deadlines that can be 5 days or less, but it can also have deadlines that are on calendar days. Calendar days can include weekends and holidays. They just can't end on a weekend or holiday. So again, talk to us about these things if you get into them and you're just not sure. Happy to help you out with that. Okay, moving on. We're going to skip a whole bunch here, and I want to get into, this is where, again, we get into the 9 p.m. stuff. So offer. This offer must be accepted by 9 p.m. on the offer expiration date unless sooner withdrawn. I want to emphasize the sooner withdrawn. There's a form. It's Form 36, which is, Form 36A, which is a withdrawal of offer or counter offer. Form 36 is a counteroffer, by the way. You can use that to make a counteroffer. But 36A, you're going to use to withdraw an offer. So say your client makes an offer on a house and they then call you up and say, hey, this other house just came on the market. Can we go see it? And their offer has not been accepted yet, and they love this other house. And they are planning to do a very aggressive offer where there's no doubt that they're going to get this other house. They need to get out of the house that they've already sent in an offer before that offer gets accepted. Otherwise, they're going to have to jump through hoops to get out of the purchase of that house. So that's where the Form 36A comes in. You've got to withdraw the existing offer before it's accepted by the other party. This can happen on the seller side too. So say you make an offer to a seller and they send you a counter offer, and then they get a better offer that they would rather take because they're not under contract with you yet. They need to withdraw their counter offer to you before they accept that other offer. Otherwise, they could end up having two parties who are entitled to purchase their home, and that's not good ever. Okay. We've had a few of those, and unfortunately, they almost always end up in lawsuits. And it's always the broker that pays the money on those. So anyway, talk to us about those things. But whatever you do, if you've got an offer that you're going to make an offer, if you've got one offer outstanding that's not answered yet, and you're going to make another offer, get the first one withdrawn before. Okay, don't wait around on that, because it can happen just like that in a heartbeat, that the other party accepts your offer and then all of a sudden you're under contract on two. Counteroffer, any change in the terms presented in an offer or counteroffer other than the insertion of or change to a seller's name or seller's warranty of citizenship, that's the FERPTA thing, shall be considered a counteroffer. If a party makes a counteroffer, the other party shall have until 9 p.m. on the counteroffer expiration date to accept that offer or counteroffer unless sooner withdrawn. And then finally, if no expiration date is specified for an offer or counteroffer, the offer or counteroffer shall expire 2 days after the offer or counteroffer is delivered by the party making the offer or counteroffer unless sooner withdrawn. I want all of you to read, by the way, we're not going to mess with the agency disclosure. You have to, by law, hand off a copy of the real estate brokerage in Washington pamphlet. It's pamphlet P1 to both your buyer and or your seller. So this just basically has a little tiny blurb to that effect, but you've already handed it off, so you're good to go. The next one, the brokerage firm compensation. The biggest thing I want to stress here, again, is that you must fill in Section A and Section B up above on line 17. Don't leave B blank if you want the seller to pay you. Okay, because if you leave it blank, you're basically saying, seller, you don't have to pay me, which means hopefully that your buyer's going to pay you. Otherwise, you're just not going to get paid. Nothing we can do to help you there. By the way, that Form 41, the buyer brokerage services agreement, must be signed by your buyer before you write an offer. By law, technically, it must be signed by the buyer as soon as practical upon offering real estate services. But that said, you can't ask the seller for compensation if you don't have a 41 signed by your buyer saying the buyer is going to pay you compensation. And or the amendment, the 41A. Okay, so you got to have that done before you write an offer. Okay, then we get into the information verification period. We talked about that a little bit earlier. It defaults, it says here 10 days, but it's here's the key language, is that you have to give notice identifying the materially inaccurate information. Material means it has substantial value, affects the value of the property. Inaccurate also means that they've given you something that misled you, made you think one thing when something else was the fact. Pretty rare that you can use the information verification period, but it is something that in theory could be used. I can only think of a couple of times I've reviewed a file where it actually came up. I talked about earlier on Form 22D, that first clause that says that you're not responsible for knowing the square footage of the property or some other things. Here's a bigger one. This is the, when your buyer or your seller says that you should have known. There's a lot of things you don't have to know, and this paragraph outlines that. Okay, but buyer and seller agree that, except as provided in this agreement, all representations and information regarding the property and the transaction are solely from the seller or buyer and not from any broker. Okay, there it is. You got your information from your client. You don't have this information. The parties acknowledge that the brokers are not responsible for assuring that the parties perform their obligations under this agreement, and that none of the brokers has agreed to independently investigate or confirm any matter related to this transaction, except as stated in this agreement or a separate writing signed by such broker. Okay, so perform their obligations. Say your seller says they're going to do certain repairs and they don't get it done. You're not responsible for the fact that they didn't fulfill that obligation. Okay, this would protect you in a lawsuit where you get named. You can read the rest of this. It's good information about all the different things that you don't have to know about a house. All right, mold, earthquake, flooding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. The last one has to do with fair housing. All of you are required to take a fair housing class within your first renewal. Please take that class. It's a 6-hour clock hour class. But here's a basic thing that says that the seller and the buyer acknowledge that they are not discriminating based on any of the federally or state or county protected status of any person. Okay, so with that, really quick, I just want to see if there's any hands that I haven't seen or anything like that. Any questions on the stuff we covered? There's a lot here. Again, I want you to reread it and get to know it in your spare time.
I'm good. Perfect.
All right, very good. Thanks, Philip. Okay, we're going to move on to another form then. We're going to move into the financing addendum. By the way, we're not going to go back to the buyer brokerage services agreement. I think we covered that within the purchase and sale agreement part of it. So we've pretty well covered that. But now we're going to move into financing. Again, not going to read all of it to you. I'm going to hit it with the highlights. Number one, it talks about what type of loan your client is going to get. So this is a contract. Your buyer is stating here, I am going to get a conventional first mortgage, or I am going to get a VA loan. If your client were to say that they were going to get a VA loan, and then for some reason they can't qualify for a VA loan, but there's a program out there somewhere where they can qualify for a conventional mortgage, they need to get permission before they change the type of loan. Okay, so when you provide a pre-approval letter, that pre-approval letter says the type of loan they're going to get. It also says how much they're going to put down. That's a commitment. It also says the name of the lender. That is not a commitment. So, and the reason being is that you're going to state very specifically the type of loan and how much down payment here in the offer. And the pre-approval letter is probably going to say that. It doesn't say who your loan is going to be with, and it actually gives you 5 days to apply for a loan. That pre-approval letter may be with who you're ultimately going to apply for a loan. It may just be a starting point, and maybe they're going to apply with somebody else at a later date. They'll have 5 days to interview lenders and figure out which one they're going to use. So that's kind of the first paragraph here. Okay, so the agreement's contingent on the buyer obtaining the following type of loan. You'll specify that. If that's going to change later, you've got to get permission from the seller later before they make the change. All right, it follows up to say, in addition to the loans, the buyer shall make a down payment in the amount of X number of dollars. If your client is going to put any other amount down, and that could have an impact as to whether or not they close, get the loan and close, you need to get a permission to change that. But if they say they're going to put 20% down and they decide they're going to put 50% down anyway, they can do that without getting permission, because no lender is going to balk at them putting 50% down later on. But if there's any chance whatsoever that they're not going to get a loan because maybe they don't qualify even at 50% down, then they need to get that permission. Okay, so it's be careful with these. Those two things, you have to get permission prior to them changing anything on their loan having to do with those. Next, it says the buyer shall make application for the loans to pay the balance of the purchase price and pay the application fee if required for the subject property within, and it defaults at 5 days. If you don't fill it in, it's going to say 5. I prefer that you fill in and say 5 so your buyer doesn't have any misunderstanding as to, how many days they've got to apply for their loan. And then please emphasize with them, applying for the loan doesn't mean pre-approval. It means you've actually filled out something saying that you're committed to using that lender, and starts the process of actually moving forward on the loan. And so here, the next paragraph or the next line say, for the purposes of this addendum, application means the submission of the buyer's financial information for the purposes of obtaining an extension of credit, including the buyer's name, income, Social Security if required, the property address. That's why pre-approval doesn't qualify, because you didn't know the address yet. Purchase price, you also did not know the purchase price on when you got the pre-approval, and the loan amount, which you only had a vague idea what the loan amount was going to be when you did the pre-approval. So those are all things that you will have provided to the lender, and you're in order to verify that you actually had application. Talk to your buyer, make sure they physically apply for the loan within the 5 days or however you fill in on that blank. Otherwise, they have technically waived their financing. That's the next paragraph, and they could lose their earnest money if they fail to close because of it. So let's read this next thing, the waiver of financing contingency. Waiver means that essentially all it means is that if they fail to close on this contingency, they lose their earnest money. They can fail and they can terminate, but it doesn't mean they're going to get their earnest money back. Okay, so if the buyer fails to make application for financing for the property within the agreed time, or 2, changes the type of loan, and that does include the down payment, at any time without the seller's prior written consent, there's a form for that. It's a form 22 AC is where you get the seller's consent. Get that signed by the seller before they physically apply for a different loan. Or 3, changes the lender without the seller's prior written consent after the agreed upon time to apply for financing expires, then the financing contingency shall be deemed waived. Okay, so if they do any of those 3 things, they've waived it. And if they've waived it and they can't get a loan and they can't close, they lose their earnest money. That includes even if it doesn't appraise well. There's some questions that come up on changing the lender. Okay, so Cobalt Mortgage is a lender. Movement Mortgage is a lender. Bank of America is a lender. Wells Fargo's a lender. Quicken Loans is a lender. Bob Lender, who works for Quicken Loans, he's a loan officer. He's not the lender. Okay, so if Bob quits Quicken Loans or gets fired by Quicken Loans and your client is working with Quicken Loans, they have not changed their lender. But if they apply with Quicken Loans on day 5, and then they are talking to their friend who, they're talking to you, and you say, oh God, I wish you would have used Movement Mortgage. And so then they apply with Movement Mortgage on day 6, they've violated the terms, they've waived their financing, and if they can't close, they will lose their earnest money. So it's really important that they understand that. So the lender is the bigger picture. That's the company who's offering the loan, the company that gave them the pre-approval. The lender is not the loan officer who signed the pre-approval letter. So that's something that comes up frequently. So anyway, they don't have to change. Like I say, if their lender disappears and somebody else ends up taking over their file, that's fine, as long as they're with the same company. Moving forward, this is an area of constant confusion. We fill in a number of days here. Defaults at 21. Okay, so you have to check. It gives you a select A or B, and a default's A if neither is selected. Do you think your buyer read that? No. So select A or B, one or the other, okay? Under A, the seller can tell your buyer, it's called notice to perform, and that is buyer, prove that you're good to go on your lending. So on day 21 or later, okay, 21 is calendar days, that'd be 20 days. So if we did mutual today, it'd be 21 days from today. Today is the 17th, that's So that would mean approximately the October 8th. I don't know, something like that. No, that's not even right. Anyway, 21 days would be, yeah, it's going to be somewhere in that, the low teens, somewhere there. But anyway, you'll want to count that out on a calendar and see what that day is going to be. But on that day, the seller can give you a notice. It's a Form 22AR, and say, hey, buyer, we want you to waive your financing. So your buyer's going to need to call their lender. They've got 3 days to find out from their lender if they're going to qualify for their loan or not. And by the end of that 3rd day, if they haven't waived their financing, which means they have, if they don't close because of a loan issue other than appraisal, they could lose their earnest money. Okay, so different waiver than what we saw up above in 1B, but it's still fairly inclusive. Anyway, they have 3 days to make a decision as to whether or not they want to waive. If they choose not to waive, then the seller can terminate the contract. It's one of the rare situations where the seller can terminate. This gives them the right. My personal preference is you fill in a number of days you think here that until you're going to find out that you are actually approved for the loan. Talk to your loan officer, tell the loan officer to talk to the underwriter at their company, and based on what they know about your client, how long is it going to take for them to truly, truly be underwritten? That's a safe number of days to put in that box. Okay, so if they can be underwritten in 21 days, awesome, put 21. If it's going to take 25 days, put 25 here, because your buyer is going to have to make a hard decision if they are asked to perform. Now, if the seller doesn't send over a Form 22AR asking you to perform, then it's a non-issue and you can go forward to closing. But they can send it over anytime after day 21. So just be aware of that. Your buyer could be asked to perform at any given point. Say you need an extension and the seller has not asked you to perform yet, and the 21 days has passed and you ask for an extension, that's going to be a red flag to the seller, and they're going to say, well, wait a minute, we want to see proof that you can actually even get this loan. So they may ask you to perform at that point. Okay, so that can come up. The next paragraph talks about that the seller can give you notice of termination after 3 days. But I want to move down to the next one, 3. So 2A3. Appraisal less than sales price. So up above in B, 1B, it basically says that you're waiving the appraisal if you waive your financing by changing the loan type, or if you change lenders, that kind of thing. If you fail to apply for the loan, you've also waived your right to claim a low appraisal. In Part 2A and B, you have a clause that says appraisal less than sales price. So your waiver of financing contingency under this paragraph 2A, okay, 2A right here, will or will not constitute waiver of paragraph 5, which is the appraisal less than sales price. So again, up above in 1B, if you waive your financing by doing something wrong, you are waiving paragraph 5. In this case, if you check the box that says will not, even if the seller tells you to perform on day 21 and you go ahead and waive your financing, but you haven't got the appraisal back yet, you're still safe to possibly terminate under the appraisal clause because you've checked will not. So let's read that sentence. It was one sentence. Buyer's waiver of the financing contingency under this paragraph 2A will not constitute waiver of paragraph 5. Your buyer could also check the will box, which means that they will waive paragraph 5 if they are forced to waive their financing under paragraph 2A up above. Okay. So they could also choose 2B, and we see this every once in a while in more aggressive offers where multiple offers where you want to prove that you're going to waive your financing in a short period of time or some given period of time. Basically meaning that if you can't get your financing for any reason other than appraisal, you're going to lose your earnest money. And that can be assuring to a seller. So you could put any number of days here in this space. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Okay, but basically if we left it at the default 21 days, then basically on day 21, your buyer is automatically waiving their financing unless prior to day 21, they terminate the agreement because they find out from their lender that they can't get a loan. Okay, so they really want to know their financing's in a good place. And that number 2B, part 2, the appraisal less than sales price, it applies specifically to this paragraph 2B, but it's identical to what goes on up above when it talked about 2A. So if your buyer has waived their financing under 2B, they either will or will not constitute the waiver of their appraisal less than sales price clause. And we'll get to that in a moment here. But anyway, you know, you can check will or will not, depending on your circumstances. Will means you need to know the outcome of that appraisal. Will means you don't care about the outcome of the appraisal. But by the way, when you waive your right to an appraisal, it means you're going to have to come up with the additional down payment or something to cover any difference between the appraised value and the offered value. So say your client offered $550,000 on a home that's listed for $500,000 and it appraises for $500,000, the list price. There's a $50,000 delta between offered and listed. Who's going to cover that? Well, we're going to get into that in the appraisal clause, but basically if the buyer can't cover that difference, then they may want to ask the seller to reduce the value or something like that down to the appraised value. But if you've waived your appraisal clause, you don't get to have that decision. You're going to have to come up with that in this example, that $50,000. That's a big chunk of change to come up with. If you're already putting $100,000 down, and then you got to put another $50,000 in additional down payment to cover the appraised value, so the lender will lend based on the value of the home. Okay, this comes up more when you're making offers above the list value. When you're making an aggressive offer, a seller will look at your offer as only being as good as the value of the home, unless you have either waived your appraisal clause or agreed to do additional down payment with a Form 22 AD. So hopefully this doesn't come up often. We're seeing it less and less these days, but boy, when the market was hot, we saw this stuff all the time. So if you're ever writing an offer that's above the list price and the seller is pushing back because they're concerned it's not going to appraise, just know that there could be decisions that have to be made. And that's when you call your manager, and we'll talk to you about the various ways you can address that issue or not address the issue and just run the risk. We're going to move down to the next page on this now. This is if your buyer wants the seller to pay closing costs, this is where you ask for it. Don't use a Form 34. I see that every once in a while, and I want you to avoid Form 34. That's a blank addendum. You're effectively writing legal language. You are effectively acting as an attorney as soon as you write that. More brokers get sued over Form 34 than probably anything else. And attorneys love Form 34 because it's going to be a payday for them. So my recommendation is avoid Form 34 or talk to your manager before you write it up. Sometimes it's something super simple. Yeah, you can use it for that. But boy, if you're getting complex, if you're getting into moving things and if then type scenarios, then 34 can be dangerous. If you use Form 34 and you put something in there that doesn't have any consequences if it's not upheld, it's useless anyway. So there's no point in writing it up if that's going to be the case. So anyway, talk to your manager about those things so that we can help you get language that is going to be effective for you in those scenarios. Anyway, so it says here that the seller shall pay up to either a dollar amount or a percentage of the purchase price, which shall be applied to the buyer's loan and settlement costs, including prepaids, loan discount, loan fee, interest buy down, financing, closing, or other costs allowed by the lender. Talk to the lender before you ask for any closing costs, because they may say no. And if they do, then your buyer is just not going to get that money. They're not going to be entitled to it. This goes on to talk about some circumstances that have to do with FHA loans and VA loans. If you're working with one of those, it can affect how much your buyer is required to pay in closing costs. There's limits, especially in VA. So read that and talk to your manager about it if you've got questions. If your buyer needs to terminate because they don't get financing, or if the appraisal doesn't clear, anything like that. But if for some reason your buyer finds out their loan has been denied, and if they have not waived their financing contingency, they can get their earnest money back. But they have to meet 3 requirements. 1A, the date that they applied for their loan has to be verified by the lender. And it has to include a copy of the loan estimate that was provided by to the buyer from the lender. We have to be able to prove that the buyer possessed sufficient non-contingent funds to close. So that money needs to be liquid or easily liquefiable. It shouldn't be money that is at all risky. And C, the reason the buyer was unable to obtain financing by closing. It doesn't say that there's a reason that's a bad reason. So, some people are worried that, oh, the lender, I didn't turn in some documents in time. That could be held against the buyer if they try to get their earnest money back, but it doesn't say here that that is necessarily a reason that they can't get their earnest money back. Okay, but you have to receive those. The buyer has to supply the reason that they were unable to get their financing, and the lender should provide that in their denial letter. All right, moving into the notice of low appraisal. Okay, so number 1, if the buyer finds out from their lender that the appraisal is going to be low, and if the buyer doesn't want to cover the difference between the appraised value and the amount they offered, then they're going to have to ask for it using a Form 22AN within 3 days of receiving that appraisal. As a buyer agent, as a buyer broker, don't necessarily call the listing broker and tell them up front that the appraisal is going to come in low until you've actually received a copy of the appraisal and you've talked to your buyer to find out what it is they wish to do going forward because of the low appraisal. But if they want to make a request, they have to do it within 3 business days of receiving the lender's appraisal. Once they give it to the seller, then the seller has 10 calendar days. I emphasize that because it's over 5 after the buyer's notice of low appraisal, to give notice that they are going to ask for a reappraisal or a reconsideration of value. By the way, the lender has to approve whoever is doing the reappraisal or reconsideration of value, and they won't always do that. So that can be risky. And when one appraiser comes in way below, a lot of times it means other appraisers are going to come in way below too. Next one says the seller consents to reduce the purchase price to an amount not more than the amount specified in the appraisal. So in our example, we offered $550 on a $500,000 listed home. The appraisal came back at $500. The seller says, you know what? We'll reduce the purchase price to $500. Then the buyer is obligated, unless they're on VA or FHA, to go ahead and move forward at that $500,000 level, and the lender will agree to that too. VA and FHA give the buyer the right to say no to that scenario and terminate anyway under the appraisal clause. That's just a weird little thing that they've got. So even though the seller says that they're going to lower the price to the appraised value, the buyer can walk under VA, FHA, or USDA. That's one reason that VA and FHA loans or pre-approvals are not as well valued in multiple offer situations, you'll find out. Then there's the next one, and that's where the buyer and the seller can meet somewhere in the middle. So seller's proposal to reduce the purchase price to an amount more than the amount specified in the appraisal, and the buyer to pay the necessary additional funds. So again, say it's we offered 550, appraisal came back at 500. The seller says, you know what, I'll cut you off on, I'll cut you loose on 25 grand. So we'll lower the price to 525, but buyer, you still need to come in with another 25 grand in order to make this happen. That's kind of that scenario. And finally, there's a situation where the seller could reject the buyer's notice of low appraisal entirely. Then the buyer is left with one choice, and that is to pay the difference, or they need to terminate under the appraisal clause. That's where it's so important to have the appraisal clause intact and not have it waived under either 1B or 2A or 2B. Because the seller doesn't have an obligation to lower the price. The buyer has, if the seller does either two, if they do 2 or 3, or excuse me, 3 or 4 here, if they either propose to reduce it to more than the amount specified in the appraiser, or they reject it, then the buyer has 3 days to figure out what they want to do. And it could be that they, they can waive their financing, which means the appraisal goes away. They can terminate the agreement, which means that they get their earnest money back. If it's FHA or VA, they have the right to terminate and get out no matter what. So those are the things I want to cover in Form 22A. Those are the biggies. And I do encourage you to read the rest of this form and get to know it. There's this extension of closing clause. This is only if, so say your client receives a good faith estimate up front that they're going to be paying a loan of 6%. And when it comes down to closing, they find out that they're going to be paying closer to 7%. That's a big difference, right? And it could change their monthly payment. This clause requires the transaction to be extended automatically for an additional 4 days so that the buyer can confront their lender and say, you're cheating me. You are violating the Truth in Lending Act, and hopefully get it all worked out. If for some reason the buyer cannot get it worked out with their lender, the buyer still has to close at the higher interest rate, and then they're going to have to sue their lender after the fact. Okay, so never a fun thing to tell your buyer that they're going to have to sue somebody over something, but it happens. All right, moving on. Oh, let's real quick. Any questions on 22A, what we covered? And again, if not, awesome, but questions will come up as you work through transactions. I do encourage you to reach out early and often. All right, we're going to move to Form 22D. We already covered 1 and 2 on 22D. Seller cleaning. If you check this box, the seller has to clean the property. What is clean? It's a very subjective thing, okay? There shouldn't be piles of trash anywhere. That's definitely not clean. And that includes in the crawl space. Yes, I've seen a couple of those where they dumped it in the crawl space. But anyway, trash and debris and rubbish needs to be picked up. It's basically broom clean. It's not white glove clean. It's not, it doesn't mean they've sanitized everything. Your buyer may want to go in and do their own personal cleaning to get it sanitized if that's the case. It means they've vacuumed the carpet. It doesn't mean they've deep cleaned the carpet. It means they've swept the floor. It doesn't mean they've mopped the floor. Countertops were wiped down with a paper towel. Doesn't mean that they were, cleaned with Lysol, that kind of thing. Bathrooms, similar thing. Anyway, if it's important to your buyer that it's cleaned to a professional level, go to other here, okay, on the second page and say to be professionally cleaned, and you can even specify a company if you really want to get into that kind of thing, at seller's expense. And then it's all taken care of. If there is any trash or debris left around on the property, your buyer has, you know, they're to make it go away, your buyer's probably going to have to hire somebody to make it go away. And if they do have to do that, they can sue the seller in small claims court for the cost of that debris removal. The next one, personal property. This is basically saying the seller doesn't have the right to come by 2 days after closing and say, hey, I left my lawnmower in the garage. Can I have it back? Your buyer could give the lawnmower back. That's just one example, by the way, of personal property that's left on the property after closing. Craziest one I ever saw was a buyer left 2 jet skis on the property in the garage on a trailer, and they didn't take them away prior to closing. Those technically became the property of the buyer. The buyer had to jump through some licensing hoops to claim them, but they were theirs. Anyway, but I'm going to go back to my lawnmower example or something like that, something that gets left behind. The seller leaves the lawnmower behind 2 days after closing. You come by and say, I forgot to grab my lawnmower when I moved out. Can I have it, please? The buyer doesn't have to agree to that. The buyer can say, no, it's mine now. The buyer could agree to it, and that's fine. The other side is that the buyer may have sold it on OfferUp because maybe the buyer had a better lawnmower themselves, and they took their $250 for this lawnmower and spent it on something else. They don't have to give the $250 to the seller, okay, because he didn't remove it from the property prior to the possession date. So it says here, it highlighted, any personal property remaining on the property thereafter shall become the property of the buyer and may be retained or disposed of as buyer determines. Next one is, we're going to ask the seller to attest to the fact that this property is on a water main and is on a sewer, or, you know, whatever it is. A lot of that you can get from the front page of the listing, where it says if it's on septic or if it says it's on well. But anyway, you can check these boxes, and that way the seller is saying, yep, this is what I represent, that the property is on these things. If you find out later, it does give your client the ability to sue the seller for inaccurate statements, especially if there's a value to it of some type or other. Say your client has to work from home, and they need high-speed internet to do that, and you check the cable and internet boxes, only to find out that they actually don't have high speed, and they're still doing dial-up at that house. And by the way, there are some places out in East King County that is still the case. They don't have high speed in some places. So anyway, that would be, you know, your buyer bought the home based on bad information that ended up causing them the hardship of either having to pay a ton of money to bring in internet, or to change that they can't work from home anymore and they had to commute into office all the time. It could be pretty devastating. So anyway, this is the place where they have to verify that for you. The next one, new construction only. That's the insulation thicknesses. And if you're doing new construction, you're probably going to get a builder addenda along with your offer, or maybe completely in place of the offer, depending on who the builder is, if it's one of the big ones, and it'll always have the insulation in there because that is a federal law. Properties occasionally have leased property, like a security system, propane tank, a satellite dish. There can be other things. Water heaters occasionally are leased as well, but this gives you a chance to review the lease and verify whether or not you want to move forward with that lease. And if the lease is too much for your buyer to handle, they can actually terminate and get their earnest money back. Okay, if there is an HOA, always check box 8. We want your buyer has the right to receive HOA docs. They have a right to understand what it is they're purchasing. So please check this box. I understand on some aggressive offers where there's multiple offers and you're competing with a bunch of waived everything, maybe you would not check this box, but what I'd prefer you do is put 0 days right here. Okay, if you put 0, I don't know why my keyboard's not functioning there half the time. There we go, 0. Put 0 days in there, it means on the day of mutual acceptance, you've waived this. Basically, it's done. Okay, on day 0, if they haven't provided it by day 0, then you get then that's okay. But you want to put 0 in twice here. Okay, so it's 10 get 10 days or 0 days to give it to us, and we have 0 days to review it. Really quickly, I want to pop back to Form 22A. I apologize. I didn't cover this earlier. If your buyer wants to waive their financing, but they have to get financing, that can happen every once in a while. If you're working with Movement Mortgage, for example, they pre-underwrite you. They give you the 100% go-ahead before you ever even write an offer on a home. You're going to know what you can do there. Very rare that you're not going to close. That's a pretty safe situation. And say you're up against cash offers, but you want to make your offer as good as cash, basically saying that we're not going to terminate due to financing. Type in 0 here. Okay, so that means that you are this financing contingency shall conclusively be deemed waived unless within 0 days after mutual acceptance, the buyer gives notice of termination of this agreement. This is powerful for your buyer because they are seeing that 0 days. They should be asking you about it. Hopefully you're telling them a little bit about it. Hey, we're going to, you told me that you are good waiving your financing. Your lender has told us all that you are fine waiving your financing. This is how we're going to do it. You put 0 in there. And if they've got the money to cover the appraised value, put will. Okay, there you've got now a very powerful situation. There's no way you can back out due to your financing. So that's only in an aggressive multiple offer situation that you'd probably want to do that, but that's how you would do it. Same thing on the HOA. So you can put in 0 days, and 0 means the day you turn in the offer, which means effectively you don't have any time to back out. Okay, because it has to happen on that day. If there's a homeowners association, sometimes there's a transfer fee, especially on condominiums. If that's the case, if you don't check anything, it means it's the seller is going to pay that. If you leave this one blank, that's okay, because we would prefer the seller doesn't see that and then they're stuck paying that. But definitely check the box. Okay, because if you don't check the box, then the seller doesn't have to do anything. If the seller for some reason is excluding items, we typically see it on heirloom quality like chandeliers or certain drapes that were, that kind of thing. It can be certain plants that were planted because to memorialize either the birth of a child or something like that. Who knows? There can be things that get excluded. The seller has to put them here. Otherwise, whatever it says in included items on general term C on your Form 21 will stay with the house unless they exclude it here. And your buyer has the chance to either agree or disagree with that. And then finally, there's the home warranty. I check the box here. I check it on every buyer I work with through my entire career. I've always bought a home warranty for my buyer. I feel like it's a good value. That said, I'm not going to say you have to do it. That's not a judgment thing. It costs me, $450, $500 out of every closing. It gives my buyer a lot of peace of mind for the first year. And we have found, we meaning the industry has found, that if you buy a home warranty for your buyer, they're much less likely to turn around and blame you, the broker, if they find a problem with the house later. Even though our contract says that you're not responsible for things going on with the house, doesn't mean they may not blame you. Means they may not refer you to other people. If you give them a warranty, that item gets fixed, and then they're excited about you, and they will refer you and say, yeah, my broker was awesome. He even bought me she bought me a warranty. So anyway, this is what you can do if you want to do that. You don't have to, and I don't cast any judgment on it, other than I do it, and I've got my reason for doing it. I just shared that with you. So up to you. All right, we're gonna move. So that's it on this form. There can be other, if you are selling your own property or a relative's property, you have to give notice. Or if you're buying a property for yourself or for a relative, you have to put notice in here, and you check the other box. And then you'd fill in here that buyer broker is related to the buyer. Or you could say is the buyer, that kind of thing. You do have to, by law, give notice that if you are a party to the transaction and you're a broker, you have to make sure that that is stated somewhere in the contract, and there it is. That's how you do that. All right, real quickly, we're going to move into Form 35. This is your inspection addendum. If you're going to waive your inspection, please use Form 35W. I see some people cross this form off. That's not as good. Use Form 35W. It's made for that. The W stands for waived. Okay, so this one has a lot of timelines in it, but the big things I want to emphasize here is the buyer's general home inspection must be performed by the buyer or a person licensed under the Revised Code of Washington 18280. The buyer may engage specialists to conduct further inspections on the property. So the initial inspection has to be done by the buyer or a licensed inspector. It can't be a contractor who is not a licensed inspector, even if they're a licensed contractor. It can't be your brother-in-law knows a lot about houses. That said, the buyer can do his own inspection and bring his brother-in-law along with him. And your buyer is technically doing the inspection. He's just getting some input. It gets a little sketchy there, but anyway, we don't want, if your buyer is going to back out, we want them to at least do something inspection wise. If your buyer knows they're not going to buy the property, and they don't want to do the inspection after all, have them go out there and do a buyer inspection anyway, so there's no question about what it is. And then your buyer can terminate the contract no matter what under this inspection clause, even if there's nothing written down saying there's anything wrong with the house. You don't have to verify there's anything wrong with the house. It goes on to talk here about the sewer inspection. I would check May. Sewer inspections are becoming a big deal. We've had several brokers who didn't encourage their client to get a sewer inspection. And then the home, within weeks of moving into the home, for some reason, the sewer backed up. And they found out it's due to a pipe that collapsed. Well, had they done a sewer inspection, they may have been able to determine that the pipe was on the verge of collapse because of all the roots that were cracking through the pipe or something like that. So we do encourage a sewer inspection. We encourage inspections in general. We want it to be the buyer's decision if they choose not to. If they're in a multiple offer situation and you know they're up against offers where the inspection is being waived, you can tell your buyer that. Don't say, in order to win, you better waive your inspection. Just say, hey, by the way, you're up against other offers that are waiving the inspection. I know this, the listing broker told me. So if you choose to do that, we can write it up in that way. But I personally would prefer that you do it, that you buy a house where you are entitled to the option to get an inspection done. Okay, so that's kind of it. You want to make it their idea. They need to tell you, no, I really love this house and we will waive our inspection. Awesome. I will write that up with a Form 35W. There you go. Anyway, when you do the inspection, do the sewer inspection. It defaults to 10 days to do the inspection. A lot of buyers tend to go much less than that. 5 days is pretty common that I see. Some are 3. Talk to your inspector, find out how fast they can get there if your offer is inspected or accepted, and work within that time frame. The fewer days you put here, the better for the seller. Ultimately, your buyer's going to give a notice that A, that they approve the inspection and they're waiving the contingency, or B, they're disapproving the inspection and terminating the agreement. C, they can do an additional inspection. That's something that we would ask for in another form. I'll show you something about that. And D, they propose repairs to the property or modifications to the agreement, which basically means either reduction in purchase price or the seller is going to pay some closing costs, and so the buyer doesn't have to spend that money out of their pocket, can spend it after they close instead. Oh, it's really important here, this next little part here, that the buyer shall not provide the inspection report. Here's what happens if you do. Waiver of the contingency. If the buyer provides any portion of the inspection report to the seller without the seller's prior written consent, the inspection contingency shall conclusively be deemed waived. So that would be if you copy and paste text from the inspection report, or you copy and paste a picture from the inspection report. If you send the entire inspection report, if you send a page from the inspection report, that's all a portion of the inspection report. Now, if you summarize the inspection report, when they say that, you know, we've analyzed the roof and it appears that some of the shingles are failing and blah, 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 blah. You know, they go on through a long narrative about why the roof is bad, but they ultimately say that the roof needs to be replaced. Well, you can say in your request, the seller will replace the roof, and leave it at that. Okay, you can put statements. Don't put all of the narrative that leads up to it. That's the easiest way to get away from accusations that you've copied and pasted inspector language. Now, if the seller does want to see inspector language, they want to see proof that something was bad, you're going to request that with a Form 35C, C standing for consent, and the seller has to sign that form. And if they do, then you can send them either a portion of the inspection if they check that box, or you can send them the entire inspection if they check that box. So it's really important that you be careful on that. If you've ever got questions, again, contact your manager. We'll help you come up with a good solid basis on that, so that you're not causing your client to inadvertently waive their inspection. What happens when they waive their inspection? Say that there was a lot wrong with the house, but you send the inspection report over without getting consent to do so. Your buyer is therefore officially having waived their inspection, and they're not going to be able to back out and fail to buy this home that has all kinds of problems. So that's why it's so important to follow that particular rule. And then you can ask for additional time. In this case, it defaults to 5 days, okay, for an additional inspection. And that's where up here it says that you can have plumbers, electricians, roofers, etc. Those are the common ones, by the way, to do additional inspections. Go in and look at that. It could be you do a sewer scope and the sewer guy says, wow, you know, this thing has some bigger problems going on. You may want to have a plumber come out and check it out. Well, you can do that as well. So anyway, you have to check a box on your Form 35R. That's your inspection response. Let's go to that super fast here. Here it is. You can check the box that says we approve it and we're moving forward. Great. And check the next box that says we disapprove the inspection and we're terminating. Great. Next one is we do the additional inspections. Once you check that, you send it over to the other broker and you automatically get that additional 5 days or whatever you put on your inspection request. 5 days again is 5 days or less. It's business days, not calendar days. Doesn't include the weekend, cannot end on a weekend. So you can have your plumber or roofer or whatever come out and do that. Then after you've done the additional inspection, if you find out there are things you're going to ask for, or if you're just going to move forward, or if you're going to terminate, then you do a brand new Form 35R, where you check the appropriate box and move forward then. So you don't use this form twice. If you ask for the additional inspection, you only use it that one time. You'll use a fresh one the next time around. And ultimately, you can ask for repairs or modifications. And here it could say, you know, that the roof needs replacing. You know, whatever, you can write it up as detailed as you want. It could be that you're going to ask for closing costs in lieu of the repairs. Lenders would rather you didn't write that on this form. They would rather that that you write C-34, or it could be 22A, where you modify 22A to get the closing costs put there, something like that. And the reason is that lenders don't want to feel as though they're paying for problems. And so they don't mind paying for closing costs. So by putting this here, it could be any number of different things. So this is the safe way to do it, to keep the lending moving forward. Seller has X number of days, defaults at 3 days to respond to you. So if you ask for stuff, they have the choice to agree to that. And then you're moving forward. No more questions asked. The seller could say, we'll do part of it, but not all of it. They could choose to reject everything, or they could choose to reject everything, but give you something give you something different in exchange. So say you asked for $15,000 in closing costs, they could say they reject that proposal, but they agree to replace the roof. Then that's fine. You'll get the roof instead. Other than agreeing to everything, any of these other boxes are things that are open to your buyer having the right to negotiate further. Your buyer has the choice of, 1, accepting the response and agreeing to close, or 2, they can reject the response and they'll terminate. All this has to happen within 3 days, by the way. So say we received the seller's notice today, we have until Friday at 9 p.m. to respond here. And there's a final one. This is one that confuses people. It's where the buyer rejects the seller's response, but offers the attached alternative proposal for modification. Checking that box does nothing for your buyer. You have to get it agreed in advance. So you're going to do a Form 34 or something, saying what your buyer wants from the seller, and the buyer has to sign that. If the buyer doesn't sign whatever your alternative response is by Friday at probably about 7 p.m., your buyer is going to need to make some decisions, because they're going to have to respond by Friday at 9 p.m. with one of these other boxes, that either they're going forward, or they're doing this, or maybe they're accepting. No, they wouldn't even use the third box in that case. So they're either going to accept what the seller's offering, or they're going to get out. So don't check this box and call it good. Don't check this box without already knowing and having a full agreement between the buyer and the seller as to what is going to transpire from the inspection. Then you can check this box and call it good. Okay, once you've got the Form 34 with the specifics all agreed upon by everybody, then you can check that box. But you have to do that within 3 days. It doesn't repeat.